Theory of beauty. We have so far discussed the Hindu view of art mainly from the internal evidence of the art itself. There remains, what is more exactly pertinent to the title of those chapters, to discuss the Hindu aesthetic as it is expressly formulated and elaborated in the abundant Sanskrit and Hindi literature on poetics and the drama. We shall find the general conclusions are reached which are applicable, not only to literature, but to all arts alike. The discussion begins with the defense of poesy. This is summed up in the statement that it may contribute to the achievement of all or any of the four ends of life. A single word rightly employed and understood is compared to the cow of plenty, yielding every treasure, and the same poem that is of material advantage to another or upon another occasion. The question follows, what is the essential element in poetry? According to some authors, this consists in style or figures, or in suggestion vyanjana, to which we shall recur in discussing the varieties of poetry. But the greater writers refute these views and are agreed that the one essential element in poetry is what they term rasa, or flavor. With this term, which is the equivalent of beauty or aesthetic emotion in the strict sense of the philosopher, must be considered the derivative adjective rasavant, having rasa, applied to a work of art, and the derivative substantive rasika, one who enjoys rasa, a connoisseur or lover, and finally rasasvadana, the tasting of rasa, i.e., aesthetic contemplation. A whole literature is devoted to the discussion of rasa and the conditions of its experience. The theory, as we have remarked, is worked out in relation to poetry and drama, especially the classic drama of Kalidasa and others. When we consider that these plays are essentially secular in subject and sensuous in expression, the position arrived at regarding its significance will seem all the more remarkable. Aesthetic emotion, rasa, is said to result in the spectator, rasika, though it is not effectively caused, through the operation of determinants vibhava, consequence, anubhava, moods bhava, and involuntary emotions sattva bhava. Thus, determinants, the aesthetic problem, plot, theme, etc., viz., the hero and other characters and the circumstances of time and place. In the terminology of Croce, these are the physical stimulants to aesthetic reproduction. Consequents, deliberate manifestations of feeling, as gestures, etc. Moods, transient moods 33 in number, induced in the characters by pleasure and pain, a.g., joy, agitation, impatience, etc. Also permanent 9, viz., the erotic, heroic, odious, furious, terrible, pathetic, wondrous and peaceful. Involuntary emotions, emotional states originating in the inner nature, involuntary expressions of emotion such as horripilation, trembling, etc. 8 in all. In order that a work may be able to evoke rasa, one of the permanent moods from a master motif to which all other expressions of emotion are subordinate. That is to say, the first essential of a rasavant work is unity. As a king to his subjects, as a guru to his disciples. Even so, the master motif is lord of all other motifs. If, on the contrary, a transient emotion is made the motif of the whole work, this extended development of a transient emotion tends to the absence of rasa, or as we should now say, the work becomes sentimental. Pretty art which emphasizes passing feelings and personal emotion is neither beautiful nor true. It tells us of meeting again in heaven, it confuses time and eternity, loveliness and beauty, partiality and love. Let us remark in passing that while the 9 permanent moods correspond to an identical classification of rasas or flavors is 9 in number, the rasa of which we speak here is an absolute, and distinct from any one of these. The 9 rasas are no more than the various colorings of one experience, and are arbitrary terms of rhetoric used only for convenience in classification, just as we speak of poetry categorically as lyric, epic, dramatic, etc., without implying that poetry is anything but poetry. Rasa is tasted, beauty is felt, only by empathy, infilling, sadharana, that is to say by entering into, feeling, the permanent motif, but it is not the permanent motif itself, for, from this point of view, it matters not with which of the permanent motifs we have to do. It is just here that we see how far Hindu aesthetic had now departed from its once practical and hedonistic character. The Dasharupa declares plainly that beauty is absolutely independent of the sympathetic, delightful or disgusting, exalted or lowly, cruel or kindly, obscure or refined, actual or imaginary. There is no subject that cannot evoke rasa in man. Of course, a work of art may and often does afford us at the same time pleasure in a sensuous or moral way, but this sort of pleasure is derived directly from its material qualities, such as tone or texture, assonance, etc., or the ethical peculiarity of its theme, and not from its aesthetic qualities. The aesthetic experience is dependent of this, and may even, as Dhanamjay says, be derived in spite of sensuous or moral displeasure. Incidentally, we may observe that the fear of art which prevails amongst Puritans arises partly from the failure to recognize that aesthetic experience does not depend on pleasure or pain at all. And when this is not the immediate difficulty, then from the distrust of any experience which is beyond good and evil, and so devoid of a definitely moral purpose. The tasting of rasa, the vision of beauty, is enjoyed, says Vishwanatha, only by those who are competent thereto, and he quotes Dharmadatta to the effect that those devoid of imagination, in the theatre are but as the woodwork, the walls, and the stones. It is the matter of common experience that it is possible for a man to devote a whole lifetime to the study of art, without having once experienced aesthetic emotion. Historical research, as Crocer express it, directed to illumine a work of art by placing us in a position to judge it, does not alone suffice to bring it to birth in our spirit, for pictures, poetry, and every work of art produce no effect save on souls prepared to receive them. Vishwanatha comments very pertinently on this fact when he says that, even some of the most eager students of poetry are seen not to have a right perception of rasa. The capacity and genius necessary for appreciation are partly native, ancient, and partly cultivated, contemporary, but cultivation alone is useless, and if the poet is born, so too is the rasika, and criticism is akin to genius. Indian theory is very clear that instruction is not the purpose of art. On this point Dhanamjay is sufficiently sarcastic. As for any simple man of little intelligence, he writes, who says that from dramas, which distill joy, the gain is knowledge only, as in the case of history and the like, mere statement, narrative, or illustration, homage to him, for he has averted his face what is delightful. The spectator's appreciation of beauty depends upon the effort of his own imagination, just as in the case of children playing with the clay elephants. Thus, technical elaboration, realism in art is not by itself the cause of rasa, as marked by Rabindranath Tagore. In our country, those of the audience who are appreciative, are content to perfect in their own mind by the force of their own feeling. This is not different from what is said by Shukracharya with reference to images. The defects of images are constantly destroyed by the power of the virtue of the worshipper who has his heart always set on God. If this attitude seems to us dangerously uncritical, that is to say dangerous to art, or rather to accomplishment, let us remember that it prevailed everywhere in all periods of great creative activity, and that the decline of art has always followed the decline of love and faith. Tolerance of an imperfect work of art may arise in two ways: the one uncritical, powerfully swayed by the sympathetic, and too easily satisfied with a very inadequate correspondence between content and form; the other creative, very little swayed by considerations of charm, and able by force of true imagination to complete the correspondence of content and form which is not achieved or not preserved in the original. Uncritical tolerance is content with prettiness or edification, recoils from beauty that is difficult; creative tolerance is indifferent to prettiness or edification, and is able from a mere suggestion, such as an awkward, primitive, or a broken fragment, to create or recreate a perfect experience. Also, the permanent motif becomes rasa through the Rasika's own capacity for being delighted, not from the character of the hero to be imitated, nor because the work aims at the production of aesthetic emotion. How many works which have aimed at the production of aesthetic emotion, that is to say, which were intended to be beautiful, have failed of their purpose. The degrees of excellence in poetry are discussed in the Kavya Prakasha and the Sahitya Darpana. The best is where there is a deeper significance than that of the literal sense. In minor poetry, the sense overpowers the suggestion. In inferior poetry, significantly described as variegated or romantic chitra, the only artistic quality consists in the ornamentation of the literal sense, which conveys no suggestion beyond its face meaning. Thus narrative and descriptive verse take a low place, just as portraiture does in plastic art, and indeed, the Sahitya Darpana excludes the last kind of poetry altogether. It is to be observed that the kind of suggestion meant is something more than implication or double entendre. In the first case we have to do with mere abbreviation, comparable with the use of the words, etc. In the second we have a mere play on words. What is understood to be suggested is one of the 9 rasas. It is worth nothing that we have here a departure from, and I think, an improvement on Croce's definition, expression as art. A mere statement, however completely expressive, such as, the man walks, or A plus B2 equals A2 plus 2 A plus B2, is not art. Poetry is indeed a kind of sentence, but what kind of sentence? A sentence ensouled by rasa, i.e., in which one of the 9 rasas is implied or suggested, and the savoring of this falver, rasavandana, through empathy, by those possessing the necessary sensibility is the condition of beauty. What then are rasa and rasavandana, beauty and aesthetic emotion? The nature of this experience is discussed by Vishwanatha in the Sahitya Darpana. It is pure, invisible, self-manifested, compounded equality of joy and consciousness, free of admixture with any other perception, the very twin brother of mystic experience Brahmasvandana Sahodara, and the very life of it is supersensuous, lokottara wonder. Further, it is enjoyed by those who are competent thereto, in identity, just as the form of God is itself the joy with which it is recognized. For that very reason it cannot be an object of knowledge, its perception being invisible from its very existence. Apart from perception it does not exist. It is not on that account to be regarded as eternal in time or as interrupted, it is timeless. It is again, supersensuous, hyperphysical, alaukika, and the only proof of its reality is to be found in experience. Religion and art thus names for one and the same experience, an intuition of reality and of identity. This is not, of course, exclusively a Hindu view. It has been expounded by many others, such as the Neoplatonists, Schieho, Goethe, Blake, Schopenhauer and Schiller. Nor is it refuted by Croce. It has recently restated as follows: in those moments of exaltation that art can give, it is easy to believe that we have been possessed by an emotion that comes from the world of reality. Those who take this view will have to say that there is in all things the stuff out of which art is made, reality. The peculiarity of the artist would seem to be that he possesses the power of surely and frequently seizing reality, generally behind pure form, and the power of expressing his sense of it, in pure form always. Here pure form means from not clogged with unesthetic matter such as associations. It will be seen that this view is monistic. The doctrine is the universal presence of reality is that of the immanence of the absolute. It is inconsistent with the view of the world as absolute maya, or utterly unreal, but it implies that through the false world of everyday experience may be seen by those of penetrating vision, artists, lovers and philosophers glimpses of the real substrate. This world is the formless as we perceive it, the unknowable as we know it. Precisely as love is reality experienced by the lover, and truth is reality is experienced by the philosopher, so beauty is reality is experienced by the artist, and these are 3 phases of the absolute. But it is only through the objective work of art that the artist is able to communicate his experience, and for this purpose any theme proper to himself will serve, since the absolute is manifested equally in the little and the great, animate and inanimate, good and evil. We have seen that the world of beauty, like the absolute, cannot be known objectively. Can we then reach this world by rejecting objects, by a deliberate purification of art from all associations? We have already seen, however, that the mere intention to create beauty is not sufficient. There must exist an object of devotion. Without a point of departure, there can be no fight and no attainment. Here also, one does not attain to perfection by mere renunciation. We can no more achieve beauty than we can find release by turning our backs on the world. We cannot find our way by a mere denial of things, but only in learning to see those things as they really are, infinite or beautiful. The artist reveals this beauty wherever the mind attaches itself. And the mind attaches itself, not directly to the absolute, but to objects of choice. Thus we return to the earth. If we supposed we should find the object of search elsewhere, we were mistaken. The two worlds, of spirit and matter, Purusha and Prakriti, are one, and this is as clear as it to the lover or the philosopher. Those Philistines to whom it is not so apparent, we should speak of as materialists or as nihilists, exclusive monists, to whom the report of the senses is either all in all, or nothing at all. The theory of rasa set forth according to Vishwanatha and other aestheticians, belongs to totalistic monism. It marches with the Vedanta. In a country like India, where thought is typically consistent with itself, this is no more than we had a right to expect. That beauty is a state. It is very generally held that natural objects such as human beings, animals or landscapes, artificial objects such as factories, textiles or works of international art, can be classified as beautiful or ugly. And yet no general principle of classification has ever been found. That which seems to be beautiful to one is described as ugly by another. In the words of Plato, everyone chooses his love out of the objects according to his own taste. To take, for example, the human type, every race, and to some extent every individual, has an unique ideal. Nor can we hope for a final agreement. We cannot expect the European to prefer the Mongolian features, nor the Mongolian the European. Of course, it is very easy for each to maintain the absolute value of his own taste and to speak of other types as ugly, just as a hero of chivalry maintains by force of arms that his own beloved is far more beautiful than any other. In like manner, the various sects maintain the absolute value of their own ethics. But it is clear that such claims are nothing more than statements of prejudice, for who is to decide which racial ideal or which morality is best? It is a little too easy to decide that our own is best. We are at the most entitled to believe it the best for us. This relativity is nowhere better suggested than in the classic saying attributed to Majnun, when it was pointed out to him that the world at large regarded his Lalia as far from beautiful. To see the beauty of Lala, he said, requires the eyes of Majnun. It is the same with works of art. Different artists are inspired by different objects. What is attractive and stimulating to one is depressing and unattractive to another, and the choice also varies from race to race and epoch to epoch. As to the appreciation of such works, it is the same, for men in general admire only such works as by the education or temperament they are predisposed to admire. To enter into the spirit of an unfamiliar art demands a greater effort than most are willing to make. The classic scholar starts convinced that the art of Greece has never been equaled or surpassed, and never will be. There are many who think, like Michelangelo, that because Italian painting is good, therefore good painting is Italian. There are many who never yet felt the beauty of Egyptian sculpture or Chinese or Indian painting or music. That they have also the hardihood to deny their beauty, however, proves nothing. It is also possible to forget that certain works are beautiful. The 18th century had thus forgotten the beauty of Gothic sculpture and primitive Italian painting, and the memory of their beauty was only restored by a great effort in the course of the 19th century. There may also exist natural objects or works of art which humanity only very slowly learns to regard as in any way beautiful. The Western aesthetic appreciation of desert and mountain scenery, for example, is no older than the 19th century, and it is notorious that artists of the highest rank are often not understood till long after their death. So that the more we consider the variety of human election, the more we must admit the relativity of taste. And yet there remain philosophers firmly convinced that an absolute beauty, rasa, exists, just as others maintain the conception of absolute goodness and absolute truth. The lovers of God identify these absolutes with him or it, and maintain that he can only be known as perfect beauty, love and truth. It is also widely held that the true critic, Rasika, is able to decide which works of art are beautiful, rasavant, and which are not, or in simpler words, to distinguish works of genuine art from those that have no claim to be so described. At the same time, we must admit the relativity of taste, and the fact that all gods, devas and ishwaras are modeled after the likeness of men. It remains, then, to resolve the seeming contradictions. This is only to be accomplished by the use of more exact terminology. So far have I spoken of beauty, without defining my meaning, and have used one word to express a multiplicity of ideas. But we do not mean the same thing when we speak of a beautiful girl and a beautiful poem. It will be still more obvious that we mean two different things, if we speak of beautiful weather and a beautiful picture. In point of fact, the conception of beauty and the adjective, beautiful, belong exclusively to aesthetic and should only be used in aesthetic judgment. We seldom make any such judgments when we speak of natural objects as beautiful. We generally mean that such objects as we call beautiful are congenial to us, practically or ethically. Too often we pretend to judge a work of art in the same way, calling it beautiful if it represents some form or activity of which we heartily approve, or if it attracts us by the tenderness or gaiety of its color, the sweetness of its sound and the charm of its movement. But when we thus pass judgment on the dance in accordance with the sympathetic attitude towards the dancer's charm or skill, or the meaning of the dance, we ought not to use the language of pure aesthetic. Only when we judge a work of art aesthetically we may speak of the presence or absence of beauty. We may call the work rasavant or otherwise, but when we judge it from the standpoint of activity, practical or ethical, we ought to use a corresponding terminology, calling the picture, song or actor, lovely, that is to say lovable, or otherwise, the action, noble, the color, brilliant, the gesture, graceful, or otherwise, and so forth, and it will be seen that in doing this we are not really judging the work of art as such, but only the material and the separate parts of which it is made, the activities they represent, or the feelings they express. Of course, when we come to choose such works of art to live with, there is no reason why we should not allow the sympathetic and ethical considerations to influence our judgment. Why should the ascetic invite annoyance by hanging in his cell some representation of the nude, or the general select a lullaby to be performed upon the eve of battle? When every ascetic and every soldier has become an artist, there will be no more need for works of art. In the meanwhile, ethical selection of some kind is allowable and necessary. But in this selection we must clearly understand what we are doing, if we would avoid any infinity of error, culminating in that type of sentimentality which regards the useful, the stimulating and the moral elements in works of art as the essential. We ought not to forget that he who plays the villain of the piece may be a greater artist than he who plays the hero. For beauty, in the profound words of Millet, does not arise from the subject of a work of art, but from the necessity that has been felt of representing that subject. We should only speak of a work of art as good or bad with reference to its aesthetic quality. Only the subject and the material of the work are entangled in relativity. In other words, to say that a work of art is more or less beautiful, or rasavant, is to define the extent to which it is a work of art, rather than a mere illustration. However the element of sympathetic magic in such a work may be, however important its practical applications, it is not in these that its beauty consists. What, then, is beauty? What is rasa? What is it that entitles us to speak of divers works as beautiful or rasavant? What is this sole quality which the most dissimilar works of art possess in common? Let us recall the history of a work of art. There is an aesthetic intuition on the part of the original artist, the poet or creator, then the internal expression of this intuition, the true creation or vision of beauty, the indication of this by external signs language for the purpose of communication, the technical activity, and finally, the resulting stimulation of the critic or rasika to reproduction of the original intuition, or of some approximation to it. The source of the original intuition may, as we have seen, be any aspect of life whatsoever. To one creator, the scales of a fish suggest a rhythmical design, another is moved by certain landscapes, a third elects to speak of hovels, a fourth to sing of palaces, a fifth may express the idea that all things are enlinked, enlaced and enamored in terms of the general dance, or he may express the same idea equally vividly by saying that, not a sparrow falls to the ground without our Father's knowledge. Every artist discovers beauty, and every critic finds it again when he tastes of the same experience through the medium of external signs. But where is this beauty? We have seen that it cannot be said to exist in certain things and not in others. It may then be claimed that beauty exists everywhere, and this I do not deny, though I prefer the clearer statement that it may be discovered anywhere. If it could be said to exist everywhere in a material and intrinsic sense, we could pursue it with our cameras and scales, after the fashion of the experimental psychologists. But if we did so, we should only achieve a certain acquaintance with average taste, we should not discover a means of distinguishing forms that are beautiful from forms that are ugly. Beauty can never thus be measured, for it does not exist apart from the artist himself, and the rasika who enters into his experience. All architecture is what you do to it when you look upon it. Did you think it was in the white or grey stone? Or the lines of the arches and cornices? All music is what awakes in you when you are reminded of it by the instruments. It is not the violins and the cornets. Nor the score of the baritone singer, it is nearer and further than they. When every sympathetic consideration has been excluded, however, there still remains a pragmatic value in the classification of works of art as beautiful or ugly. But what precisely do we mean by these designations as applied to objects? In the works called beautiful, we recognize a correspondence of theme and expression, content and form at variance. In time and space, however, the correspondence never amounts to an identity. It is our own activity, in the presence of the work of art, which completes the ideal relation, and it is in this sense that beauty is what we do to a work of art rather than a quality present in the object. With reference to the object, then, more or less beautiful will imply a greater or less correspondence between content and form, and this is all that we can say of the object as such, or in other words, art is good that is good of its kind. In the stricter sense of completed internal aesthetic activity, however, beauty is absolute and cannot have degrees. The vision of beauty is spontaneous, in just the same sense as the inward light of the lover bhakta. It is a state of grace that cannot be achieved by deliberate effort, though perhaps we can remove hindrances to its manifestation, for there are many witnesses that the secret of all art is to be found in self-forgetfulness. And we know that this state of grace is not achieved in the pursuit of pleasure. The hedonists have their reward, but they are in bondage to loveliness, while the artist is free in beauty. It is further to be observed that when we speak seriously of works of art as beautiful, meaning that a truly works of art, valued as such apart from subject, association, or technical charm, we still speak elliptically. We mean that the external signs, poems, pictures, dances, and so forth, are effective reminders. We may say that they possess significant form. But this can only mean that they possess that kind of form which reminds us of beauty, and awakens in us aesthetic emotion. The nearest explanation of significant form should be such form as exhibits the inner relations of things, or, after Shie Ho, which reveals the rhythm of the spirit in the gestures of living things. All such works as possess significant form are linguistic, And, if we remember this, we shall not fall into the error of those who advocate the use of language for language's sake, nor shall we confuse the significant forms, or their logical meaning or moral value, with the beauty of which they remind us. Let us insist, however, that the concept of beauty has originated with the philosopher, not with the artist. He has been ever concerned with saying clearly what had to be said. In all ages of creation, the artist has been in love with his particular subject. When it is not so, we see that his work is not felt. He has never set out to achieve the beautiful, in the strict aesthetic sense, and to have the same is to invite disaster, as one who should seek to fly without wings. It is not to the artist that one should say the subject is immaterial. That is for the philosopher to say to the Philistine who dislikes a work of art for no other reason than that he dislikes it. The true critic, Rasika, perceives the beauty of which the artist has exhibited the signs. It is not necessary that the critic should appreciate the artist's meaning. Every work of art is a Kamadhenu, yielding many meanings, for he knows without reasoning whether or not the work is beautiful, before the mind begins to question what it is about. Hindu writers say that the capacity to feel beauty, to taste rasa, cannot be acquired by study, but is the reward of merit gained in the past life, for many good men and would-be historians of art have never perceived it. The poet is born, not made, but so also is the rasika, whose genius differs in degree, not in kind, from that of the original artist. In Western phraseology, we should express this by saying that experience can only be bought by experience, opinions must be earned. We gain and feel nothing merely when we take it on authority that any particular works are beautiful. It is far better to be honest, and to admit that perhaps we cannot see their beauty. A day may come when we shall be better prepared. The critic, as soon as he becomes an exponent, has to prove his case, and he cannot do this by any process of argument, but only by creating a new work of art, the criticism. His audience, catching the gleam at second hand, but still the same gleam, for there is only one, has then the opportunity to approach the original work a second time, more reverently. When I say that works of art are reminders, and the activity of the critic is one of reproduction, I suggest that the vision of even the original artist may be rather a discovery than a creation. If beauty awaits discovery everywhere, that is to say that it waits upon our recollection, in the Sufi sense and in Wordsworth's, in aesthetic contemplation as in love and knowledge, we momentarily recover the unity of our being released from individuality. There are no degrees of beauty. The most complex and the simplest expression remind us of one and the same state. The sonata cannot be more beautiful than the simplest lyric, nor the painting than the drawing, merely because of their greater elaboration. Civilized art is not more beautiful than the savage art, merely because of its possibly more attractive ethos. A mathematical analogy is found if we consider large and small circles. These differ only in their content, not in their circularity. In the same way, there cannot be any continuous progress in art. Immediately a given intuition has attained to perfectly clear expression, it remains only to multiply and repeat this expression. This repetition may be desirable for many reasons, but it almost invariably involves a gradual decadence, because we soon begin to take the experience for granted. The vitality of tradition persists only so long as it is fed by intensity of imagination. What we mean by creative art, however, has no necessary connection with novelty of subject, though that is not excluded. Creative art is the art that reveals beauty where we should have otherwise overlooked it, or more clearly than we have yet received. Beauty is sometimes overlooked just because certain expressions have become what we call hackneyed. Then the creative artist dealing with the same subject restores our memory. The artist is challenged to reveal the beauty of all experiences, new and old. Many have rightly insisted that the beauty of a work of art is dependent of its subject, and truly, the humility of art, which finds its inspiration everywhere, is identical with the humility of love, which regards alike a dog and a Brahman, and of science, to which the lowest form is as significant as the highest. And this is possible, because it is one and the same undivided all. If a beauteous form we view, thus his reflection shining through. It will now be seen in what sense we are justified in speaking absolute beauty, and in identifying this beauty with God. We do not imply by this that God, who is without parts, has a lovely form which can be the object of knowledge, but that in so far as we see and feel beauty, we see and are one with Him. That God is the first artist does not mean that He created forms, which might not have been lovely had the hand of the potter slipped, but that every natural object is an immediate realization of His being. This creative activity is comparable with aesthetic expression in its non-volitional character. No element of choice enters into that world of imagination and eternity, but there is always perfect identity of intuition expression, soul and body. The human artist who discovers beauty here or there is the ideal guru of Kabir, who reveals the supreme spirit wherever the mind attaches itself. Buddhist Primitives. The early Buddhist view of art is strictly hedonistic. Just as little as early Buddhism dreamed of an expression of its characteristic ideas through poetry, drama, or music, so little was it imagined that the arts of sculpture and painting could be anything but worldly in their purpose and effect. The arts were looked upon as physical luxuries, and loveliness is a snare. Beauty is nothing to me, says the Dasa Dhamma Sutta, neither the beauty of the body nor that comes of dress. The brethren was forbidden to allow the figures of men and women to be painted on monastery walls, and were permitted only representations of wreaths and creepers. The psychological foundations of this attitude is nowhere more clearly revealed than in a passage of the Visuddhi Marga, where we find that painters, musicians, perfumers, cooks, and elixir prescribing physicians are all classed together as purveyors of sensuous luxuries, whom others honor, on account of love and devotion to the sensations excited by forms and other objects of sense. This is the characteristic Hinayana position throughout, and it is, of course, conspicuous also in the Jaina system, and in certain phases of Brahmanical thought, particularly in the period contemporary with early Buddhism. It is only in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC that we find the Buddhists patronizing craftsmen and employing art for edifying ends. From what has just been said, however, it will be well understood that there had not at this time come into being any truly Buddhist or Brahmanical idealistic art, and thus, early Buddhist art was necessarily the popular Brahmanical art and animistic art of the day, adapted to Buddhist requirements. The only exception to this rule is that special phase of early Buddhist art which is represented by the capital of the Ashoka columns, of which the forms are not merely non-Buddhist, but of extra-Indian origin. The Indian non-Buddhist art that we have evidence of in the age of Ashoka and in the period immediately following Ashoka, is chiefly with the cult of nature spirits, the earth goddess, the Nagas or serpent kings of the waters, and the Yaksha kings who rule the 4 quarters. The Maurya types are represented by the well-known freestanding female figure 3 at Besnagar, and the Parkham figure 4 now in the Mathura Museum. The early Buddhist art of Sanchi and Bhahat, probably slightly later, reflects the prevalence of the animistic cults in placing low-relief figures of the Yaksha, guardians of the 4 quarters, as protectors of the entrance gateways. 5 That the nature spirits should thus act as guardians of Buddhist shrines reflects the essential victory of Buddhism, precisely as the story of the Naga Machalinda, who, in the literary tradition, shelters the Buddha during the week of storms. Besides the guardians of the quarters, we find at Sanchi figures of beautiful Yakshinis or dryads, whose function may be partly protective, but is also in large degree honorary and decorative. The Yakshini figure here reproduced, figure I.B., is typical of all that is best in the art of Sanchi, but in what different world this happy dryad moves from that of the Pali Suttas, where orthodox Buddhism tries to prove that, as the body when dead is repulsive, so also is it when alive. Buddhist monasticism, to use the language of Blake, sought consistently to bolt and bar the western gates, but our Sanchi dryad rather seems to say, the soul of sweet delight can never be defiled. The art of Sanchi is essentially pagan, and this appears not only in its fearless happiness, untinged by Puritan misgiving or by mystic intuition, but also in the purely representative and realistic technique. It was in the main a later Mahayana and Vaishnava achievement of the Indian lyric spirit to discover that the two worlds of spiritual purity and sensuous delight need not, and perhaps ultimately cannot, be divided. In any case, the Sanchi art is plainly not an expression of early Buddhist feeling, and so also it is not primitive, but, on the contrary, it is the classic achievement of an old popular art already long practiced in less permanent materials. If there is at this time any Buddhist art that can be fairly called primitive, it is only to be recognized in architecture, where the simple forms of early stupas, and their indecorated railings, and the severe design of the early excavated chatya halls truly reflect the intellectual and austere enthusiasm of early Buddhism. Another part of the art of Bhahat railing in the Sanchi gateways is devoted to the illustration of edifying legends, particularly stories of the former lives of the Buddha, and of the last incarnation. The work is delicately executed in low relief. We know from a contemporary inscription that amongst the craftsmen who contributed to the decoration of the Sanchi Toranas were the ivory workers of Bhilsa, and afford us a remarkable record of Indian life, with its characteristic environment, manners and cults set out with evident realism and a wealth of circumstantial detail. But for all their interest, these reliefs, too, are essentially illustrations of edifying anecdotes, and only to a limited extent, less, for example, than the similar, but, of course, very much later, illustrations at Borobudur directly express the early Buddhist view of life and death. There is, however, one respect in which that view is perfectly reflected, in the fact that the figure of the Master himself is nowhere represented. Even in the group of episodes which illustrates the great renunciation, Prince Siddhartha's departure from home, riding upon the back of the horse Kantaka, and attended by the groom Janna, Kantaka's back is bare, and we see only the figures of the devas who lift up the feet of the horse lest men should be roused by the sound of his hoofs, while the presence of the prince is only indicated by the parasol of dominion borne beside the horse. In other compositions, the Buddha is represented by symbols such as the wisdom tree or the conventionally represented footprints, the feet of the Lord, figure v. c. It will be realized at once that the absence of the Buddha figure from the world of living men, where, however, there yet remain the traces of his ministry, literally footprints on the sands of time, is a true artistic rendering of the Master's guarded silence respecting the after-death state of those who have attained nirvana. The perfect one is released from this, that his being should be gauged by the measure of the corporeal world. He is released from name and form. In the omission of the figure of the Buddha, the early Buddhist art is truly Buddhist. For the rest, it is an art about Buddhism, rather than Buddhist art. Changes were meanwhile proceeding in the material of Buddhist belief. This belief is no longer merely intellectual, but has undergone an emotional development akin to that which finds expression in the Bhakti doctrine of the Bhagavad Gita. Even they that be born of sin, even women, traffickers, and serfs, if they turn to me, come to the supreme path, be assured, O son of Kunti, that none who is devoted to me is lost. Similarly, we find, even in so early a text as the Majjhima Nikaya, that those who have not yet even entered the paths are sure of heaven if they have love and faith towards me. Gradually, the idea of Buddhahood replaces that of Aritta, the original agnosticism is ignored, and the Buddha is endowed with all the qualities of transcendental Godhead as well as with the physical peculiarities or perfections of the Superman, Mahapurusha. The Buddha thus conceived, together with the Bodhisattvas or Buddhas to be, presently engaged in the active work of salvation, became the object of a cult and was regarded as approachable by worship. In all this we see not merely an internal development of metaphysics and theology, but also the influence of the lay community, for a majority of men, and still more the majority of women, have always been more ready to worship than to know. At Amravati we still find that the Buddha is represented by symbols, but it may be clearly seen from the passionate devotion of those who worship at the symbol shrines, and many of these are women, As in the case of the fragment here reproduced in figure we see that the one adored must have been conceived in other terms than those of a purely intellectual psychological analysis. Even before the Buddha figure is represented in official Buddhist art, the Buddha had become an object of adoration, a very personal god, and it cannot surprise us that the master's figure should soon appear wherever Buddhist piety erected shrines and monuments. We know that images of Hindu gods were already in use in the 2nd century BC, and it is highly probable that Buddha figures were in similar private use long before they took their place in a public cult. Before, however, we speak of the Buddha images, we must refer to a second phase of religious experience, which plays a great part alike in the development of Buddhism and Hinduism. This is the practice of yoga, whereby enlightenment and emancipation are sought to be attained by meditation calculated to release the individual from empirical consciousness. Even in the earliest Buddhist praxis, it would be difficult to exaggerate the part which these contemplative exercises play in the spiritual history of the brethren, and to a lesser extent of laymen, for while the most abstract meditations lead to the attainment of nirvana and the station of no return, the lesser no less certainly led to rebirth in the higher heavens. It is just for purposes of meditation that lonely places and roots of trees are so highly praised in the Buddhist literature, and of this the classic example is that of the Buddha himself, who reached the final enlightenment while seated in yogi fashion at the foot of the wisdom tree. The essence of the method lies in the concentration of thought upon a single point, carried so far that the duality of subject and object is resolved into a perfect unity, when, in the words of Schelling, the perceiving self merges in the self-perceived. At that moment we annihilate time and the duration of time. We are no longer in time, but time, or rather eternity itself, is in us. A very beautiful description of the yogi is given as follows in the Bhagavad Gita, and is quoted here in a condensed form applies almost equally to Buddhist and Brahmanical practice, for the yoga is a praxis rather than a form of sectarian belief. Abiding alone in a secret place, without craving and without possessions, he shall take his seat upon a firm seat, neither over high nor over low, and with the working of the mind and of the senses held in check, with body, head and neck maintained in perfect equipoise, looking not round about him, so let him meditate, and thereby reach the peace of the abyss, and the likeness of one such, who knows the boundless joy that lies beyond the senses and is grasped by intuition, and who swerves not from the truth, is that of a lamp in a windless place that does not flicker. Long before the Buddha image became a cult object, the familiar form of the seated yogi must have presented itself to the Indian mind in inseparable association with the idea of a mental discipline and of the attainment of the highest station of self-oblivion. And when the development of imagery followed, there was no other form which could have been made a universally recognized symbol of him who had thus attained. This figure of the seated Buddha yogi, with a far deeper content, is as purely monumental art as that of the Egyptian pyramids, and since it represents the greatest ideal which Indian sculpture ever attempted to express, it is well that we find preserved even a few magnificent examples of comparatively early date. Amongst these, the colossal figure at Anuradhapura is almost certainly the best, figure 7. The same ancient Buddhist site affords examples of a bodhisattva, here reproduced on figure Ravi, and of two standing Buddhas, illustrated in figures IX and X, while nearly related to these are the standing figures of Buddhas lately excavated at Amravati, reproduced on figure 11. To all these works we may fairly assign the honored name of primitives, since their massive forms and austere outline are immediately determined by the moral grandeur of the thesis and the suppressed emotion of its realization, without any intrusion of individually operative skill. The fullness of the modeling expresses a high degree of vitality, but does not yet show the conscious elegance and suavity of Gupta types. We are not in position to precisely date these Buddhist primitives of Anuradhapura and Amravati, but they may not be earlier than the 1st or 2nd century AD and can hardly be later than the 3rd or 4th. In describing these works as primitive, it is not, of course, suggested that they are the earliest of Buddha figures extant, nor that all of them are absolutely free from any element of Western formulation, but merely that in them the primitive inspiration is better preserved than anywhere else. I have already suggested that the figures of the seated Buddha, if not the standing types, probably came into use as cult objects a good deal earlier, perhaps in the 2nd century BC, and if these were generally made in wood or other impermanent materials, this would be in accord with all that we know of the general development of Indian plastic art and architecture. In any case, as M. Foucher points out, the conventional character of the Buddha of the Kanishka reliquary denote un art déjà stereotype, et. Suffit por reporter de moins sentence en arrière et fait par suite remonte au cycle avant notre ère la création du type plastique du bien hero. The same may be said of the Bodhisattvas. Indra and Brahma were perhaps the types from which the sculptural representations of Avalokiteshvara and Maitreya were evolved, and Mr. Spooner has recorded his view that this evolution was an accomplished fact prior to any form of the Gandhara school with which we are yet familiar, pointing out here too that the forms of both are stereotyped, already in the earliest examples from Gandhara. We have so far left out of account the abundant and well-known Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara, dating from the 1st to the 4th century AD, as well as the school of Mathura, which in part derives from the older art of Sanchi and Bhahat, and is partly dependent upon Gandhara. The omission is not, as M. Foucher would suggest, par argument d'esthétician ou rancune the nationalist, but because we are here concerned to discover the sources of inspiration of Buddhist imagery and to learn how this inspiration was first and most fully expressed. That many Western formulae were absorbed into Indian art through Gandhara does not touch the question of feeling. We must avoid the common error of confusing Formensprache with Geist. It is even easy to exaggerate the importance of the Western formulae, as such, for whatever else in Buddhist art is borrowed, the cross-legged figure seated upon a lotus throne is entirely Indian in form as well as in idea, and besides this seated figure, the standing Buddha and the images of all the Buddhist gods are but of secondary importance. For several reasons, it seems probable that the actual Gandhara sculptures are mainly the work of Western craftsmen employed by the Gandhara kings to interpret Buddhist ideas, rather than Indian workmen under Western guidance, and if some of the workmen were Indian by birth, they nevertheless did not give expression to Indian feeling. We have the parallel modern example of the late Raja Ravi Verma, who, despite the nominally Indian subject matter of his paintings, entirely fails to reflect the Indian spirit. The manner in which the Western formulae have been gradually Indianized, alike in the Northwest and in the school of Mathura, and thus, as Professor Oscar Munsterberg remarks, first developed under national and Buddhist inspiration into a new and genuine art, has been studied in considerable detail by many scholars, but what is equally or more significant for our inquiry is the manner in which certain Indian formulae and Indian ideas are misrepresented at Gandhara, for misrepresentation necessarily implies the pre-existence of a type to be misinterpreted. The plainest case is afforded by the Buddha figure seated on a lotus throne, Padmasana. In Gandhara sculpture, the seated figure is uncomfortably and instably balanced on a lotus flower that is far too small, and with its pointed petals, like an artichoke, suggests a seat of penance rather than of ease. Figure V. The true sense of the Padmasana is, of course, to indicate spiritual purity or divinity, and the symbol is only appropriately combined with that of the seated yogi, when this function is fulfilled without detracting from the one essential quality of repose. It is specially emphasized in yoga texts that the seat of the yogi is to be firm and easy, sthira sukha, and where this condition is overlooked, it is impossible to recognize an immediate expression of the original thesis. The foregoing argument supports the view already mentioned, that the seated Buddha image in the age of Kanishka was déjà stereotype. It takes us, however, somewhat further, for in connection with the far stronger, though to archaeologists less convincing, aesthetic evidence, it shows plainly that Gandhara sculpture is not primitive Buddhist art. When, then, are we to look for the prototype of the seated figure, thus, Deja stereotype? Can we postulate a Roman yogi, seated on a lotus throne, and with hands in the Dhyani mudra, to set beside the Lateran Sophocles, of which the influence is evident in standing images? The suggestion is sufficiently absurd to need no refutation. The seated Buddha, as we have already suggested on a priori grounds, can only be of Indian origin, and this as being so, it will be seen how great an exaggeration is involved in speaking of the Greek origin of the image of Buddha. It has been sufficient for our purpose to explain in what senses Gandhara sculpture cannot be regarded as primitive and autochthonous Buddhist art. It has not been necessary to emphasize also how little the smug and complacent features of the Gandhara Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and their listless and effeminate gestures, reflect the intellectual vigor or the devotional passion of Buddhist thought. For the benefit of M. Foucher, however, and of other scholars who may suppose, with him, that Mr. Havel, Professor Munsterberg, and I, have cared more for Indian art than for art, I may point out that our estimate of Gandhara sculpture as of small aesthetic significance must not be taken as evidence of any prejudice against the art of Europe. It simply indicates concurrence in the view that, in the long sands and flats of Roman realism, the stream of Greek inspiration is lost forever. To admire Gandhara art, as art, is not a compliment to the greatness of the Greeks, but only shows how far that greatness has been misunderstood. If it is possible for a European critic to write of the mosaics of the Galla Placidia at Ravenna that they are still costly classical, and that there is a nasty, woolly realism about the sheep, and about the good shepherd more than a suspicion of the stodgy, Greco-Roman Apollo, then surely we may criticize the sculptures of Gandhara in the same terms without incurring charges of bad faith. To resume, early Buddhist art is popular, sensuous and animistic Indian art adapted to the purposes of the illustration of Buddhist anecdote and the decoration of Buddhist monuments. Gandhara art is mixed, and misinterpreted equally both Eastern and Western formulae, which must be older than itself, while it is not Buddhist in expression. The earliest Indian primitives of Buddhist art properly so called are probably lost. In northern India, the absence of primitives is partly to be accounted for by the fact that Buddhist inspiration was there absorbed, not in direct creation, but in adapting Greco-Roman motifs to its own spiritual ends. In southern India and Ceylon, the same energy working in greater isolation found a more direct expression, and though the earliest masterpieces may be lost, there are still preserved at Anuradhapura and Amravati magnificent works, which we may fairly speak of as Buddhist primitives. The Dance of Shiva. The Lord of Tilai's caught a mystic dance performs. What's that, my dear? Tiruvakagam, 12:14. Amongst the greatest of the names of Shiva is Nataraj, Lord of Dancers, or King of Actors. The cosmos is his theatre, there are many different steps in his repertory, he himself is actor and audience. When the actor beateth the drum, everybody cometh to see the show. When the actor collecteth the stage properties, he abideth alone in his happiness. How many various dances of Shiva are known to his worshippers I cannot say. No doubt the root idea behind all of these dances is more or less one and the same, the manifestation of primal rhythmic energy. Shiva is the eros protagonos of Lucian, when he wrote, "It would seem that dancing came into being at the beginning of all things, and was brought to light together with eros, that ancient one, for we see this primeval dancing clearly set forth in the choral dance of the constellations, and in the planets and fixed stars, their interweaving in interchange and orderly harmony." I do not mean to say that the most profound interpretation of Shiva's dance was present in the minds of those who first danced in frantic, and perhaps intoxicating energy, in honor of the pre-Aryan hill god, afterwards merged in Shiva. A great motif in religion or art, any great symbol, becomes all things to all men. Age after age it yields to men such treasure as they find in their own hearts. Whatever the origins of Shiva's dance, it became in time the clearest image of the activity of God which any art or religion can boast of. Of the various dances of Shiva, I shall only speak of three, one of them alone forming the main subject of interpretation. The first is an evening dance in the Himalayas, with a divine chorus, described as follows in the Shiva Pradosha Stotra, placing the mother of the three worlds upon a golden throne, studded with precious gems. Shulapani dances on the heights of Kailasa, and all the gods gather round him. Saraswati plays on the veena, Indra on the flute, Brahma holds the time-making cymbals, Lakshmi begins a song, Vishnu plays on a drum, and all the gods stand round about. Gandharvas, Yakshas, Patagas, Uragas, Siddhas, Sadhyas, Vidyadharas, Amaras, Apsarasas, and all the beings dwelling in the three worlds assemble there to witness the celestial dance and hear the music of the divine choir at the hour of twilight. This evening dance is also referred to in the invocation preceding the Katha Sarat Sagara. In the pictures of this dance, Shiva is two-handed, and the cooperation of the gods is clearly indicated in their position of chorus. There is no prostrate asura trampled under Shiva's feet. So far as I know, no special interpretations of this dance occur in Shaiva literature. The second well-known dance of Shiva is called the Tandava, and belongs to his tamasic aspect as Bhairava or Veerabhadra. It is performed in cemeteries and burning grounds, where Shiva, usually in 10-armed form, dances wildly with Devi, accompanied by troops of capering imps. Representations of this dance are common amongst ancient sculptures, as at Ellora, Elephanta, and also Bhuvaneshwara. The Tandava dance is in origin that of a pre-Aryan divinity, half god, half demon, who holds his midnight revels in the burning ground. In later times, this dance in the cremation ground, sometimes of Shiva, sometimes of Devi, is interpreted in Shaiva and Shakta literature in a most touching and profound sense. Thirdly, we have the Nadanta dance of Nataraj before the assembly, Sabha, in the golden hall of Chidambaram or Tillai, the center of the universe, first revealed to gods and rishis after the submission of the latter in the forest of Taragram, as related in the Koyil Puranam. The legend, which has after all, no very close connection with the real meaning of the dance, may be summarized as follows. In the forest of Taragram dwelt multitudes of heretical rishis, following of the Mimsa. Thither proceeded Shiva to confute them, accompanied by Vishnu disguised as a beautiful woman, and Ati Sheshan. The rishis were at first led to violent dispute amongst themselves, but their anger was soon directed against Shiva, and they endeavored to destroy him by means of incantations. A fierce tiger was created in sacrificial fires, and rushed upon him, but smiled gently. He seized it with the nail of his little finger, stripped off its skin, and wrapped it about himself like a silken cloth. Undiscouraged by failure, the sages renewed their offerings, and produced a monstrous serpent, which, however, Shiva seized and wreathed about his neck like a garland. Then he began to dance, but there rushed upon him a last monster in the shape of a malignant dwarf, Muyalaka. Upon him the god pressed the tip of his foot, and broke the creature's back, so that it writhed upon the ground, and so, his last foe prostrate, Shiva resumed the dance, witnessed by gods and rishis. Then Ati Sheshan worshipped Shiva, and prayed above all things for the boon, once more to behold this mystic dance. Shiva promised that he should behold the dance again in sacred Tillai, the center of the universe. This dance of Shiva in Chidambaram or Tillai forms the motif of the South Indian copper images of Sri Nataraj, the lord of the dance. These images vary amongst themselves in minor details, but all express one fundamental conception. Before proceeding to inquire what these may be, it will be necessary to describe the image of Sri Nataraj as typically represented. The images, then, represent Shiva dancing, having 4 hands, with braided and jeweled hair of which the lower locks are whirling in the dance. In his hair may be seen a writhing cobra, a skull, and the mermaid figure of Ganga. Upon it rests the crescent moon, and it is crowned with a wreath of cassia leaves. In his right ear he wears a man's earring, a woman's in the left. He is adorned with necklaces and armlets, a jeweled belt, anklets, bracelets, finger and toe rings. The chief part of his dress consists of tightly fitting breeches, and he wears also a fluttering scarf in a sacred thread. One right hand holds a drum, the other is uplifted in the sign of do not fear. One left hand holds fire, the other points down upon the demon Muyalaka, a dwarf holding a cobra, the left foot is raised. There is a lotus pedestal, from which springs an encircling glory, Tiruvasi, fringed with flame, and touched within by the hands holding drum and fire. The images are of all sizes, rarely if ever exceeding 4 feet in total height. Even without reliance upon literary references, the interpretation of this dance would not be difficult. Fortunately, however, we have the assistance of a copious contemporary literature, which enables us to fully explain not only the general significance of the dance, but equally, the details of its concrete symbolism. Some of the peculiarities of the Nataraj images, of course, belong to the conception of Shiva generally, and not to the dance in particular. Such are the braided locks, as of a yogi, the cassia garland, the skull of Brahma, the figure of Ganga, the Ganges fallen from heaven and lost in Shiva's hair, the cobras, the different earrings, betokening the dual nature of Mahadev, whose half is Uma, and the 4 arms. The drum also is a general attribute of Shiva, belonging to his character of yogi, though in the dance, it has further a special significance. What then is the meaning of Shiva's Nadanta dance, as understood by Shavas? Its essential significance is given in texts such as the following. Our Lord is the dancer, who, like the heat latent in firewood, diffuses his power in mind and matter, and makes them dance in their turn. The dance, in fact, represents his 5 activities Panchakritya, viz. Shrishti overlooking, creation, evolution, sthiti preservation, support, samhara destruction, evolution, tirubhava veiling, embodiment, illusion, and also, giving rest, anugraha release, salvation, grace. These, separately considered, are the activities of the deities Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra, Maheshwara and Sadashiva. This cosmic activity is the central motif of the dance. Further quotations will illustrate and explain the more detailed symbolisms. And my Vilikam, verse 36, tells us. Creation arises from the drum, protection proceeds from the hand of hope, from fire proceeds destruction, the foot held aloft gives release. It will be observed that the 4th hand points to this lifted foot, the refuge of the soul. We have also the following from Chidambara Mamani Kovai. O my Lord, thy hand holding the sacred drum has made and ordered the heavens and earth and other worlds and innumerable souls. Thy lifted hand protects both the conscious and unconscious order of thy creation. All these worlds are transformed by thy hand bearing fire. Thy sacred foot, platted on the ground, gives an abode to the tired soul struggling in the toils of causality. It is thy lifted foot that grants eternal bliss to those that approach thee. These 5 actions are indeed thy handiwork. The following verses from the Tirukuttu Darshana, vision of the sacred dance, forming the 9th tantra of Tirumala's Turimantram, expand the central motif further. His form is everywhere, all-pervading in his Shiva Shakti. Chidambaram is everywhere, everywhere his dance. As Shiva is all and omnipresent. Everywhere is Shiva's gracious dance made manifest. His 5-fold dances are temporal and timeless. His 5-fold dances are his 5 activities. By his grace he performs the 5 acts. This is the sacred dance of Uma Sahai. He dances with water, fire, wind and ether. Thus our Lord dances ever in the court. Visible to those who pass over Maya and Mahamaya, illusion and super-illusion, our Lord dances his eternal dance. The form of Shakti is all delight. This united delight is Uma's body. This form of Shakti arising in time. And uniting the twain is the dance. His body is Akash, the dark cloud therein is Muyalaka. The 8 quarters are his 8 arms. The 3 lights are his 3 eyes. Thus becoming, he dances in our body as the congregation. This is his dance. Its deepest significance is felt when it is realized that it takes place within the heart and the self. Everywhere is God, that everywhere is the heart. Thus also we find another verse, the dancing foot, the sound of the tinkling bells, the songs that are sung and the varying steps, the form assumed by our dancing Gurupara. Find out these within yourself, then shall your fetters fall away. To this end, all else but the thought of God must be cast out of the heart, that He alone may abide and dance therein. In Enmai Vilikam, we find the silent sages destroying the threefold bond are established where their selves are destroyed. There they behold the sacred and are filled with bliss. This is the dance of the Lord of the assembly, whose very form is grace. With this reference to the silent sage, compare the beautiful words of Tirumula. When resting there, the yogis who attain the highest place of peace lost themselves and become idle. Where the idlers dwell is the pure space. Where the idlers sport is the light. What the idlers know is Vedanta. What the idlers find is the deep sleep therein. Shiva is a destroyer and loves the burning ground. But what does he destroy? Not merely the heavens and earth at the close of a world cycle, but the fetters that bind each separate soul. Where and what is the burning ground? It is not the place where our earthly bodies are cremated, but the hearts of his lovers, laid waste and desolate. The place where the ego is destroyed signifies the state where illusion and deeds are burnt away. That is the crematorium, the burning ground where Sri Nataraj dances, and whence he is named Sudaliyadi, dancer of the burning ground. In this simile, we recognize the historical connection between Shiva's gracious dance as Nataraj, and his wild dance as the demon of the cemetery. This conception of the dance is current also amongst Shaktas, especially in Bengal, where the mother rather than the father aspect of Shiva is adored. Kali is here the dancer, for whose entrance the heart must be purified by fire, made empty by renunciation. A Bengali hymn to Kali voices this prayer. Because thou lovest the burning ground, I have made a burning ground of my heart. That thou, dark one, haunter of the burning ground, mayest dance thy eternal dance. Naught else is within my heart, O Mother. Day and night blazes the funeral pyre. The ashes of the dead, strewn all about, I have preserved against thy coming. With death conquering Mahakala neath thy feet, do thou enter in, dancing thy rhythmic dance, that I may behold thee with closed eyes. Returning to the south, we find that in other Tamil texts the purpose of Shiva's dance is explained. In Shivajnana Siddhiyar, Supaksha, Sutra V, 5, we find, for the purpose of securing both kinds of fruit to the countless souls, our Lord, with actions 5, dances his dance. Both kinds of fruit, that is Iham, reward in this world, and Param, bliss in Mukti. Again, Anmai Vilikam, v. 32, 37, 39 inform us. The Supreme Intelligence dances in the soul. For the purpose of removing our sins. By these means, our Father scatters the darkness of illusion, Maya, burns the thread of causality, Karma, stamps down evil, Mala, Anava, Avidya, showers grace, and lovingly plunges the soul in the ocean of bliss, Ananda. They never see rebirths, who behold this mystic dance. The conception of the world process as the Lord's pastime or amusement, Leela, is also prominent in the Shaiva scriptures. Thus Tirumala writes, the perpetual dance is his play. This spontaneity of Shiva's dance is so clearly expressed in Scriabin's poem of ecstasy that the extracts following will serve to explain it better than any more formal exposition. What Scriabin wrote is precisely what the Hindu imager molded. The spirit Purusha playing. The spirit longing. The spirit with fancy, Yoga Maya creating all. Surrenders himself to the bliss, Ananda, of love. Amid the flowers of his creation Prakriti, he lingers in a kiss. Blinded by their beauty, he rushes, he frolics, he dances. He whirls. He is all rapture, all bliss, in this play, Leela. Free, divine, in this love struggle. In the marvelous grandeur of sheer aimlessness. And in the union of counter aspirations. In consciousness alone, in love alone. The spirit learns the nature swabhava of his divine being. Oh, my world, my life, my blossoming, my ecstasy. Your every moment I create. By negation of all forms previously lived through. I am eternal negation, neti, neti. Enjoying this dance, choking in this whirlwind. Into the domain of ecstasy, he takes swift flight. In this unceasing changed samara, Nitya Bhava, in this flight, aimless, divine, the spirit comprehends himself. In the power of will, alone, free. Ever creating, all irradiating, all vivifying. Divinely playing in the multiplicity of forms, he comprehends himself. I already dwell in thee, O, my world. Thy dream of me twas I coming into existence. And thou art all, one wave of freedom and bliss. Single quote. By a general conflagration, Mahapralay, the universe, samsara, is embraced, the spirit is at the height of being, and he feels the tide unending of the divine power, Shakti, of free will. He is all daring. What menaced, now is excitement. What terrified, is now delight. And the universe resounds with the joyful cry I am. This aspect of Shiva's immanence appears to have given rise to the objection that he dances as do those who seek to please the eyes of mortals, but it is answered that in fact he dances to maintain the life of the cosmos and to give release to those who seek him. Moreover, if we understand even the dances of human dancers rightly, we shall see that they too lead to freedom. But it is nearer the truth to answer that the reason of his dance lies in his own nature. All his gestures are unnatural, swabhavaja, spontaneous, and purposeless, for his being is beyond the realm of purposes. In a much more arbitrary way, the dance of Shiva is identified with the Panchakshara, or 5 syllables of the prayer Shivaye Yanama, Hail to Shiva. In Enmai Vilikam we are told, if this beautiful 5 letters be meditated upon, the soul will reach the land where there is neither light nor darkness, and their Shakti will make it one with Shivam. Another verse of Enmai Vilikam explains the fiery arch Tiruvasi. The Panchakshara in the dance are identified with the mystic syllable, Om, the arch being the combo or hook of the ideograph of the written symbol. The arch over Sri Nataraj is Omkara, and the Akshara which is never separate from the Omkara is the contained splendor. This is the dance of the Lord of Chidambaram. The Tiru Arul Payan, however, ch. X. 3 explains the Tiruvasi more naturally as representing the dance of nature, contrasted with Shiva's dance of wisdom. The dance of nature proceeds on one side, the dance of enlightenment on the other. Fix your mind in the center of the latter. I am indebted to Mr. Nillaswamy Pillai for a commentary on this. The first dance is the action of matter, material and individual energy. This is the arch, Tiruvasi, Omkara, the dance of Kali. The other is the dance of Shiva, the Akshara inseparable from the Omkara, called Ardhamatra or the 4th letter of the Pranava, Chaturta Menturium. The first dance is not possible unless Shiva wills it and dances himself. The general result of this interpretation of the arch is, then, that it represents matter, nature, Prakriti, the contained splendor. Shiva dancing within and touching the arch with head, hands and feet, is the universal omnipresent spirit Purusha. Between these stands the individual soul, as Ya is between Shiva and Nama. Now to summarize the whole interpretation, we find that the essential significance of Shiva's dance is threefold. First, it is the image of his rhythmic play as the source of all movement within the cosmos, which is represented by the arch. Secondly, the purpose of his dance is to release the countless souls of men from the snare of illusion. Thirdly, the place of the dance, Chidambaram, the center of the universe, is within the heart. So far I have refrained from all aesthetic criticism and have endeavored only to translate the central thought of the conception of Shiva's dance from plastic to verbal expression, without reference to the beauty to verbal expression, without reference to the beauty or imperfection of individual works. But it may not be out of place to call attention to the grandeur of this conception itself as a synthesis of science, religion and art. How amazing the range of thought and sympathy of those rishi artists who first conceived such a type as this, affording an image of reality, a key to the complex tissue of life, a theory of nature, not merely satisfactory to a single clique or race, nor acceptable to the thinkers of one century only, but universal in its appeal to the philosopher, the lover, and the artist of all ages and all countries. How supremely great in power and grace this dancing image must appear to all those who have striven in plastic forms to give expression to their intuition of life. In these days of specialization, we are not accustomed to such a synthesis of thought, but for those who saw such images as this, there could have been no division of life and thought into watertight compartments. Nor do we always realize, when we criticize the merits of individual works, the full extent of the creative power which, to borrow a musical analogy, could discover a mood so expressive of fundamental rhythms and so profoundly significant and inevitable. Every part of such an image as this is directly expressive, not of any mere superstition or dogma, but of evident facts. No artist of today, however great, could more exactly or more wisely create an image of that energy which science must postulate behind all phenomena. If we would reconcile time with eternity, we can scarcely do so otherwise than by the conception of alternations of phase extending over vast regions of space and great tracts of time. Especially significant, then, is the phase alternation implied by the drums, and the fire which changes, not destroys. These are but visual symbols of the theory of the day and night of Brahma. In the night of Brahma, nature is inert, and cannot dance till Shiva wills it. He rises from his rapture, and dancing sends through inert matter pulsing waves of awakening sound, and lo! Matter also dances, appearing as a glory round about him. Dancing, he sustains its manifold phenomena. In the fullness of time, still dancing, he destroys all forms and names by fire and gives new rest. This is poetry, but nonetheless, science. It is not strange that the figure of Nataraj has commanded the adoration of so many generations past, familiar with all skepticisms, expert in tracing all beliefs to primitive superstitions, explorers of the infinitely great and infinitely small, we are worshippers of Nataraj still. Indian images with many arms. Certain writers, speaking of the many-armed images of Indian art, have treated this peculiarity as an unpardonable defect. After 300 AD, says Mr. Vincent Smith, Indian sculpture properly so-called hardly deserves to be reckoned as art. The figures of both men and animals become stiff and formal, and the idea of power is clumsily expressed by the multiplication of members. The many-headed, many-armed gods and goddesses whose images crowd the walls and roofs of medieval temples have no pretensions to beauty, and are frequently hideous and grotesque. Mr. Maskell speaks of these hideous deities with animals' heads and innumerable arms. Sir George Birdwood considers that the monstrous shapes of the Puranic deities are unsuitable for the higher forms of artistic representation, and this is possibly why sculpture and painting are unknown as fine arts in India. Quotations of this kind could be multiplied, but enough has been given to show that for a certain class of critics there exists the underlying assumption that in Indian art the multiplications of limbs or heads, or addition of any animal attributes, is in itself a very grave defect, and fatal to any claim for merit in the works concerned. In reply to criticisms of this kind, it would be useless to cite examples of Greek art such as the victory of Samothrace at the head of Hypnos, of Egyptian, such as the figures of Shakhet or other animal divinities, of Byzantine or medieval angles, or modern works such as some of M. Rodin's. For it is clear that all these, if the critics be consistent, must suffer equal condemnation. Let me digress at this point to class the critics, for I fear that I ought to apologize for putting forward in this chapter what is obvious. The difficulty is one that has been raised exclusively by philologists and historians. In a considerable experience, I have never heard these objections raised by artists or by connoisseurs. These notes are dedicated, then, only to the philologist and the historian, and may be neglected by all others. The condemnations quoted are certainly to be justified if we are to agree to find the final aim of art in representation. Then let us seek the most attractive models and carefully copy them. But this test of verisimilitude has never been anything more than the result of a popular misunderstanding. Let us submit the Indian, Greek or Egyptian figures to recognized standards, and to criticism a little more penetrating than is involved in merely counting heads or arms. Leonardo says that that figure is most worthy of praise which by its action best expresses the passion that animates it. Chieho demands that the work of art should exhibit the fusion of the rhythm of the spirit with the movement of living things. Mr. Holmes suggests that a work of art must possess in some degree the four qualities of unity, vitality, infinity and repose. In other words, a work of art is great insofar as it expresses its own theme in a form at once rhythmic and impassioned. Through a definite pattern it must express a motif deeply felt. From this point of view it would seem that we must take each work of art upon its own merits. To apply the simplest tests just quoted, I wish to speak with the greatest possible simplicity. An image with many arms or heads may be called an inferior work of art, or inartistic, if it lacks any one of the four qualities demanded by Mr. Holmes, or as we may say, if it is not felt. But if it has such qualities, if it is felt, need we further concern ourselves with arithmetic? The artist does not choose his own problems. He finds in the canon instruction to make such and such images in such and such a fashion. For example, an image of Nataraj with 4 arms frontispiece, of Brahma with 4 heads, figure 12, of Mahisha Mardini with 10 arms, figure 13, or of Ganesha with an elephant's head. Our critics are bold enough to assert that in obeying these instructions he cannot create a work of art. It would have been fairer and more moderate to suggest that the problems propounded are often very difficult. This would have left open the way to recognize a successful effort, if such could be found. To have overcome the difficulties would then be a proof of artistic capacity, and I suppose it should be the aim of the historian of art to discover such proofs. The accompanying illustration, figure 13, shows a Javanese figure of Mahisha Mardini with 10 arms, slaying the demon Mahisha. She is here a dread avenging power, yet she is neither cruel nor angry, but rather sad with the sadness of those who are wise, playing an inevitable part, though at heart no more than the spectator of a drama. This entire figure, damaged as it is, shows what tenderness may be expressed, even in Tamasic images. And this peace and tenderness find expression in the movement of the whole figure, and not by any arbitrary means. No part of the whole is at war with any other, and this is what we mean by unity. It would indeed be futile to condemn an image such as this because it has 10 arms. Or take the Nataraj image of the primal rhythmic energy underlying all phenomenal appearances and activity. Here is perpetual movement, perpetually poised, the rhythm of the spirit. The death of Hiranyakashipu, figure 14, is a work that may be called grotesque. We have long learnt, however, that this cannot be used as a mere term of abuse. It would be difficult to imagine a more splendid rendering of the well-known theme of Empire's king who met his death at the hands of the avenging deity in man-lion form. The hand upon the shoulder, the shrinking figure with the mocking smile that has had no time to fade, what could be more terrible? These are figures expressing by their action their animating passions, or if not so, then none have ever been. It would be unkind to contrast a work such as this with the truth to nature of the Laocoon. In these figures we cannot speak of the many arms as additional members, because in a human being they might appear to be such. We have here a work of art which is, or is not a unity. If a work is a unity we can no more speak of added elements, than we can speak of ornaments in a work of art as something added to an expression that would not otherwise be beautiful. It is not by addition or removal that we create. Before these works we can only ask, are these, or are they not, clear and impassioned expressions of their subject matter? All unprejudiced and competent observers would then agree that amongst Indian images there are some of which we can say that they are such adequate expressions, and of others that they are not, but to recognize those and these require a rather more subtle approach than that involved in the arithmetical process of counting arms or heads. Certain developments in the most modern art could be quoted in comparison with the Indian complex figures, and indeed, the method of these is more than modern. Some painters of the present day have sought by many strange devices to create a synthetic and symphonic art representing a continuity of thought or action, and an interpretation of ideas belonging to more than a single phase of personality, an art of interpretation. And if, as we now realize, even the human personality is compound, we should understand that this must be even more true of cosmic divinity, who is, indeed, able by a division of upadhis, to function in many places at one time. To reflect such conceptions in art demands a synthetic rather than a representative language. It might well be claimed, then, that this method adopted sometimes in India, sometimes in Egypt, sometimes in Greece, and still employed, has proved successful from the practical point of view, of pure expression, the getting said what had to be said, and this is after all the sure and safe foundation of art. These forms remains potentially equally satisfactory, too, whether as philosophers we regard them as purely abstract expressions, or with the artists themselves regard them as realistic presentations of another order of life than our own, deriving from a deva loka, other than the world we are familiar with, but not necessarily unknowable or always invisible. The distinction in any case is slight, for the images equally belong to a world of their own, however we regard them. The criticism of the philologists ultimately resolves itself into a complaint that the art is not always representative true to nature. I have tried to show that it is true to experience and feeling. But aside from that, whatever in a work of art is ostensibly representative must be judged according to the logic of the world it represents, even if that would be no other than the idea world of the sadhanas and dhyan mantrams. All worlds are idea worlds of one kind or another, and we should also remember that recognition does not necessarily imply any real knowledge of things in themselves. We do not know that men have really two arms, that is merely an intelligible representation. It is no criticism of a fairy tale to say that in our world we meet no fairies. We should rather, and do actually, condemn on the score of insincerity, a fairy tale which should be so made as to suggest that in the writer's world there were no fairies. It is no criticism of a beast fable to say that after all animals do not talk English or Sanskrit. Nor is it a criticism of an Indian icon to point out that we know no human beings with more than two arms. Indian music. Music has been a cultivated art in India for at least 3,000 years. The chant is an essential element of Vedic ritual, and the references in later Vedic literature, the scriptures of Buddhism, and the Brahmanical epics show that it was already highly developed as a secular art in centuries preceding the beginning of the Christian era. Its zenith may perhaps be assigned to the imperial age of the Guptas, from the 4th to the 6th century AD. This was the classic period of Sanskrit literature, culminating in the drama of Kalidasa, and to the same time is assigned the monumental treatise of Bharat on the theory of music and drama. The art music of the present day is a direct descendant of these ancient schools, whose tradition have been handed down with commence and expansion in the guilds of the hereditary musicians. While the words of a song may have been composed at any date, the musical themes communicated orally from master to disciple are essentially ancient. As in other arts and in life, so here also India presents to us the wonderful spectacle of the still surviving consciousness of the ancient world, with a range of emotional experience rarely accessible to those who are preoccupied with the activities of overproduction, and intimidated by the economic insecurity of a social order based on competition. The art music of India exists only under cultivated patronage, and in its own intimate environment. It corresponds to all that is most classical in the European tradition. It is the chamber music of an aristocratic society, where the patron retains musicians for his own entertainment and for the pleasure of the circle of his friends, or it is temple music, where the musician is the servant of God. The public concert is unknown, and the livelihood of the artist does not depend upon his ability and will to amuse the crowd. In other words, the musician is protected. Under these circumstances, he is under no temptation to be anything but the musician. His education begins in infancy, and his art remains a vocation. The civilizations of Asia do not afford to the insufficient amateur those opportunities of self-expression which are highly appreciated in Europe and America. The arts are nowhere taught as a social accomplishment. On the one hand, there is the professional, proficient in a traditional art, and on the other the lay public. The musical cultivation of the public does not consist in everybody doing it, but in appreciation and reverence. I have indeed heard the strange objection raised that to sing the music of India one must be an artist, and this objection seems to voice a typically democratic disapproval of superiority. But it would be nearly as true to say that the listener must respond with an art of his own, and this would be entirely in accord with Indian theories of aesthetic. The musician in India finds a model audience technically critical, but somewhat indifferent to voice production. The Indian audience listens rather to the song than to the singing of the song. Those who are musical, perfect the rendering of the song by the force of their own imagination and emotion. Under these conditions, the actual music is better heard than where the sensuous perfection of the voice is made a sine qua non, precisely as the best sculpture is primitive rather than suave, and we prefer conviction to prettiness. It is like the outward poverty of God, one whereby his glory is nakedly revealed. Nonetheless, the Indian singer's voice is sometimes of great intrinsic beauty, and sometimes used with sensitive intelligence as well as skill. It is not, however, the voice that makes the singer, as so often happens in Europe. Since Indian music is not written, and cannot be learnt from books, except in theory, it will be understood that the only way for a foreigner to learn it must be to establish between himself and his Indian teachers that special relationship of disciple and master which belongs to Indian education in all its phases. He must enter into the inner spirit and must adopt many of the outer conventions of Indian life, and his study must continue until he can improvise the songs under Indian conditions and to the satisfaction of Indian professional listeners. He must possess not only the imagination of an artist, but also a vivid memory and an ear sensitive to microtonal inflections. The theory of scale is everywhere a generalization from the facts of song. The European art scale has been reduced to 12 fixed notes by merging nearly identical intervals such as D sharp and A flat, and it is also tempered to facilitate modulation and free change of key. In other words, the piano is out of tune by hypothesis. Only this compromise, necessitated in the development of harmony, has made possible the triumphs of modern orchestration. A purely melodic art, however, may be no less intensely cultivated, and retains the advantages of pure intonation and modal coloring. Apart from the keyed instruments of modern Europe, there scarcely exists an absolutely fixed scale. At any rate, in India the thing fixed is a group of intervals, and the precise vibration value of a note depends on its position in a progression, not on its relation to a tonic. The scale of 22 notes is simply the sum of all the notes used in all the songs. No musician sings a chromatic scale from C to C with 22 stopping places, for this world be a mere tour de force. The quarter tone, or shruti, is the microtonal interval between two successive scale notes, but as the theme rarely employs 2 and never 3 scale notes in succession, the microtonal interval is not generally conspicuous except in ornament. Every Indian song is said to be in particular raga or ragini, ragini being the feminine of raga, and indicating an abridgment or modification of the main theme. The raga, like the Old Greek and the ecclesiastical mode, is a selection of 5, 6, or 7 notes, distributed along the scale, but the raga is more particularized than a mode, for it has certain characteristic progressions, and a chief note to which the singer constantly returns. None of the raga employs more than even substantive notes, and there is no modulation. The strange tonality of the Indian song is due to the use on unfamiliar intervals, and not to the use of many successive notes with small divisions. The raga may be best defined as a melody mold or the ground plan of a song. It is this ground plan which the master first of all communicates to the pupil, and to sing is to improvise upon the theme thus defined. The possible number of ragas is very large, but the majority of systems recognize 36, that is to say 6 ragas, each with 5 rajanas. The origin of the ragas is various. Some, like Pahirik, are derived from local folk song, other, like Jog, from the songs of wandering ascetics, and still others are the creation of great musicians by whose names they are known. More than 60 are mentioned in a Sanskrit-Tibetan vocabulary of the 7th century, with names such as, with a voice like a thundercloud, like the god Indra, and, delighting the heart. Amongst the raga names in modern use may be cited, spring, evening beauty, honey flower, the swing, intoxication. Psychologically the word raga, meaning coloring or passion, suggests to Indian ears the idea of mood, that is to say that precisely as in ancient Greece, the musical mode has definite ethos. It is not the purpose of the song to repeat the confusion of life, but to express and arouse particular passions of body and soul in man and nature. Each raga is associated with an hour of the day or night when it may be appropriately sung, and some are associated with particular seasons or have definite magic effects. Thus there is still believed the well-known story of a musician whose royal patron arbitrarily insisted on hearing a song in the Deepak raga, which creates fire. The musician obeyed under protest, but as the song proceeded, he burst into flames, which could not be extinguished even though he sprang into the waters of the Jumna. It is just because of this element of magic, and the association of the ragas with the rhythmic ritual of daily and seasonal life, that their clear outlines must not be blurred by modulation, and this is expressed, when the ragas are personified as musical genii, by saying that, to sing out of the raga, is to break the limbs of these musical angels. A characteristic story is related of the prophet Narada, when he was still but a learner. He thought that he had mastered the whole art of music, but the all-wise Vishnu, to curb his pride, revealed to him in the world of the gods, a spacious building where there lay men and women weeping over their broken arms and legs. They were the Ragas and Rajanas, and they said that a certain sage of the name of Narada, ignorant of music and unskillful in performance, had sung them amiss, and therefore their features were distorted and their limbs broken, and until they were sung truly there would be no cure for them. Then Narada was humbled, and kneeling before Vishnu prayed to be taught the art of music more perfectly, and in due course he became the great musician priest of the gods. Indian music is a purely melodic art, devoid of any harmonized accompaniment other than a drone. In modern European art, the meaning of each note of the theme is mainly brought out by the notes of the chord which are heard with it, and even in unaccompanied melody, the musician hears an implied harmony. Unaccompanied folk song does not satisfy the concert-goer's ear. As pure melody it is the province only of the peasant and the specialist. This is partly because the folk air played on the piano or written in staff notation is actually falsified, but much more because under the conditions of European art, melody no longer exists in its own right, and music is a compromise between melodic freedom and harmonic necessity. To hear the music of India as Indians hear it, one must recover the sense of a pure intonation and must forget all implied harmonies. It is just like the effort which we have to make when for the first time, after being accustomed to modern art, we attempt to read the language of early Italian or Chinese painting, where there is expressed with equal economy of means all that intensity of experience which nowadays we are accustomed to understand only through a more involved technique. Another feature of Indian song, and so also of the instrumental solo, is the elaborate grace. It is natural that in Europe, where many notes are heard simultaneously, grace should appear as an unnecessary elaboration, added to the note, rather than a structural factor. But in India the note and the microtonal grace compose a closer unity, for the grace fulfills just that function of adding light and shade which in harmonized music is attained by varying degrees of assonance. The Indian song without grace would seem to Indian ears as bald as the European art song without the accompaniment which it presupposes. Equally distinctive is the constant portamento, or rather, glissando. In India it is far more the interval than the note that is sung or played, and we recognize accordingly a continuity of sound. By contrast with this, the European song, which is vertically divided by the harmonic interest and the nature of the keyed instruments which are heard with the voice, seems to unaccustomed Indian ears to be full of holes. All the songs, except the alaps, are in strict rhythms. These are only difficult to follow at a first hearing because the Indian rhythms are founded, as in prosody, on contrasts of long and short duration, while European rhythms are based on stress, as in dance or marching. The Indian musician does not mark the beginning of the bar by accent. His fixed unit is a section, or group of bars which are not necessarily alike, while the European fixed unit is typically the bar, of which a varying number constitute a section. The European rhythm is counted in multiples of 2 or 3, the Hindu in sums of 2 or 3. Some of the countings are very elaborate. Ata Tala, for example, is counted as 5 plus 5 plus 2 plus 2. The frequent use of cross rhythms also complicates the form. Indian music is modal in times as well as melody. For all these reasons it is difficult to grasp immediately the point at which a rhythm begins and ends, although this is quite easy for the Indian audience accustomed to quantitative poetic recitation. The best way to approach the Indian rhythm is to pay attention to the phrasing, and ignore pulsation. The Indian art song is accompanied by drums, or by the instrument known as a tambura, or by both. The tambura is of the lute tribe, but without frets. The 4 very long strings are tuned to sound the dominant, the upper tonic twice, and the octave below, which are common to all ragas. The pitch is adjusted to suit the singer's voice. The 4 strings are fitted with simple resonators, shreds of wool between the string and the bridge, which are the source of their life, and the strings are continuously sounded, making a pedal point background very rich in overtones, and against this dark ground of infinite potentiality the song stands out like an elaborate embroidery. The tambura must not be regarded as a solo instrument, nor as an object of separate interest like the piano accompaniment of a modern song. Its sound is rather the ambient in which the song lives and moves and has its being. India has, besides the tambura, many solo instruments. By far the most important of these is the veena. This classic instrument, which ranks with the violin of Europe and the koto of Japan, and second only to the voice in sensitive response, differs chiefly from the tambura in having frets, the notes being made with the left hand and the strings plucked with the right. The delicate nuances of microtonal grace are obtained by deflection of the strings, whole passages being played in this manner solely by a lateral movement of the left hand, without a fresh plucking. While the only difficulty in playing the tambura is to maintain an even rhythm independently of the song, the veena presents all the difficulties of technique that can be imagined, and it is said that at least 12 years are required to attain proficiency. The Indian singer is a poet, and the poet a singer. The dominant subject matter of the songs is human or divine love in all its aspects, or the direct praise of God, and the words are always sincere and passionate. The more essentially the singer is a musician, however, the more the words are regarded merely as the vehicle of the music. In art song the words are always brief, voicing a mood rather than telling any story, and they are used to support the music with little regard to their own logic, precisely as the representative element in a modern painting merely serves as the basis for an organization of pure form or color. In the musical form called alap, an improvisation on the raga theme, this preponderance of the music is carried so far that only meaningless syllables are used. The voice itself is a musical instrument, and the song is more than the words of the song. This form is especially favored by the Indian virtuoso, who naturally feels a certain contempt for those whose first interest in the song is connected with the words. The voice has thus a higher status than in Europe, for the music exists in its own right and not merely to illustrate the words. Rabindranath Tagore has written on this. When I was very young, I heard the song, "Who Dressed You Like a Foreigner?" And that one line of the song painted such a strange picture in my mind that even now it is sounding in my memory. I once tried to compose a song myself under the spell of that line. As I hummed the tune, I wrote the first line of the song, "I know thee, thou stranger," and if there were no tune to it, I cannot tell what meaning would be left in the song. But by the power of the spell of the tune, the mysterious figure of that stranger was evoked in my mind. My heart began to say, "There is a stranger going to and fro in this world of ours. Her house is on the further shore, an ocean of mystery. Sometimes she is to be seen in the autumn morning, sometimes in the flowery midnight, sometimes we receive an intimation of her in the depths of our heart, sometimes I hear her voice when I turn my ear to the sky." The tune of my song led me to the very door of that stranger who ensnares the universe and appears in it, and I said, "Wandering over the world, I come to thy land. I am a guest at thy door, thou stranger." One day, many days afterwards, there was someone going along the road singing, "How does that unknown bird go to and away from the cage? Could I but catch it, I would set the chain of my mind about its feet." I saw that folk song, too, said the very same thing. Sometimes the unknown bird comes to the closed cage and speaks a word of the limitless unknown. The mind would keep it forever, but cannot. What but the tune of a song could report the coming and going of that unknown bird? Because of this, I always feel a hesitation in publishing a book of songs, for in such a book the main thing is left out. This Indian music is essentially impersonal. It reflects an emotion and experience which are deeper and wider and older than the emotion or wisdom of any single individual. Its sorrow is without tears, its joy without exultation, and it is passionate without any loss of serenity. It is in the deepest sense of the words all human. But when the Indian prophet speaks of inspiration, it is to say that the Vedas are eternal, and all that the poet achieves by his devotion is to hear or see. It is then Saraswati, the goddess of speech and learning, or Narada, whose mission it is to disseminate occult knowledge in the sound of the strings of his veena, or Krishna, whose flute is forever calling us to leave the duties of the world and follow him. It is these, rather than any human individual, who speak through the singer's voice, and are seen in the movements of the dancer. Or we may say that this is an imitation of the music in heaven. The master musicians of India are always represented as the pupils of a god, or as visiting the heaven world to learn there the music of the spheres, that is to say, their knowledge springs from a source far within the surface of the empirical activity of the waking consciousness. In this connection, it is explained why it is that human art must be studied, and may not be identified with the imitation of our everyday behavior. When Shiva expounds the technique of the drama to Bharat, the famous author of the Natya Shastra, he declares that human art must be subject to law, because in man the inner and outer life are still in conflict. Man has not yet found himself, but all his activity proceeds from a laborious working of the mind, and all his virtue is self-conscious. What we call our life is uncoordinated, and far from the harmony of art, which rises above good and evil. It is otherwise with the gods, whose every gesture immediately reflects the affections of the inner life. Art is an imitation of that perfect spontaneity, the identity of intuition and expression in those who are of the kingdom of heaven, which is within us. Thus it is that art is nearer to life than any fact can be, and Mistates has reason when he says that Indian music, though its theory is elaborate and its technique so difficult, is not an art, but life itself. For it is the inner reality of things, rather than any transient or partial experience that the singer voices. Those who sing here, says Shankaracharya, sing God, and the Vishnu Purana adds, all songs are a part of him, who wears a form of sound. We could deduce from this a metaphysical interpretation of technique. In all art there are monumental and articulate elements, masculine and feminine factors which are unified in perfect form. We have here the sound of the tambura which is heard before the song, during the song, and continues after it, that is the timeless absolute, which is it was in the beginning, is now and ever shall be. On the other hand, there is the song itself, which is the variety of nature, emerging from its source and returning at the close of its cycle. The harmony of that undivided ground with this intricate pattern is the unity of spirit and matter. We see from this why this music could not be improved by harmonization, even if harmonization were possible without destroying the modal basis, for in breaking up the ground into an articulate accompaniment, we should merely create a second melody, another universe, competing with the freedom of the song itself, and we should destroy the piece on which it rests. This would defeat the purpose of the singer. Here in this ego-conscious world we are subject to mortality. But this mortality is an illusion, and all its truths are relative. Over against this world of change and separation there is a timeless and spaceless peace which is the source and goal of all our being, that noble pearl, in the words of Baman, which to the world appears nothing, but to the children of wisdom is all things. Every religious teacher offers us those living waters. But the way is hard and long, we are called upon to leave houses and lands, fathers and mothers and wives to achieve an end which in our imperfect language we can only speak of as non-existence. Many of us have great possessions, and the hardest of these to surrender are our own will and identity. What guarantee have we that the reward will be commensurate with the sacrifice? Indian theory declares that in the ecstasies of love and art we already receive an intimation of that redemption. This is also the catharsis of the Greeks, and it is found in the aesthetic of modern Europe when Goethe says, "For beauty they have sought in every age. He who perceives it is from himself set free." Aus Sech Antrukt. We are assured by the experience of aesthetic contemplation that paradise is a reality. In other words, the magical effects of a song in working near miracles are far surpassed by its effects upon our inner being. The singer is still a magician, and the song is a ritual, a sacred ceremony, an ordeal which is designed to set at rest that wheel of the imagination and the senses which alone hinder us from contact with reality. But to achieve this ordeal, the hearer must cooperate with the musician by the surrender of the will, and by drawing in his restless thought to a single point of concentration. This is not the time or place for curiosity or admiration. Our attitude towards an unknown art should be far from the sentimental or romantic, for it can bring us nothing that we have not already with us in our own hearts. The peace of the abyss which underlies all art is one and the same, whether we find it in Europe or in Asia. Status of Indian women. In the Mahabharata there is reported a conversation between Shiva and Uma. The great god asks her to describe the duties of women, addressing her, in so doing, in terms which acknowledge her perfect attainment of the highest wisdom possible to man or God, terms which it would be hard to parallel anywhere in Western literature. He says, "Thou that dost know the self in the not-self, expert in every work, endowed with self-restraint and perfect same-sightedness towards every creature, free from the sense of I and my, thy power and energy are equal to my own, and thou hast practiced the most severe discipline. O daughter of Himalaya, of fairest eyebrows, and whose hair ends in the fairest curls, expound to me the duties of women in full." Then she, who is queen of heaven, and yet so sweetly human, answers, "The duties of woman are created in the rites of wedding, when in presence of the nuptial fire she becomes the associate of her Lord, for the performance of all righteous deeds. She should be beautiful and gentle, considering her husband is her God and serving him as such in fortune and misfortune, health and sickness, obedient even if commanded to unrighteous deeds or acts that may lead to her own destruction. She should rise early, serving the gods, always keeping her house clean, tending to the domestic sacred fire, eating only after the needs of gods and guests and servants have been satisfied, devoted to her father and mother and the father and mother of her husband. Devotion to her Lord is woman's honor, it is her eternal heaven, and O Maheshwara, she adds, with a most touching human cry, I desire not paradise itself if thou art not satisfied with me. She is a true wife who gladdens her husband, says Rajashekhar in the Karpura Manjari. The extract following is from the Laws of Manu. Though destitute of virtue, or seeking pleasure elsewhere, or devoid of good qualities, a husband must be constantly worshipped as a god by a faithful wife. If a wife obeys her husband, she will for that reason alone be exalted in heaven. The production of children, the nurture of those born, and the daily life of men, of these matters woman is visibly the cause. She who controlling her thoughts, speech and acts, violates not her duty to her Lord, dwells with him after death in heaven, and in this world is called by the virtuous a faithful wife. Similar texts from a variety of Indian sources could be indefinitely multiplied. If such are the duties of women, women are accorded corresponding honor, and exert a corresponding influence upon society. This power and influence do not so much belong to the merely young and beautiful, nor to the wealthy, as to those who have lived, mothers and grandmothers, or who follow a religious discipline, widows or nuns. According to Manu, a master exceedeth 10 tutors in claim to honor, the father 100 masters, but the mother 1,000 fathers in right to reverence and in the function of teacher. When Rama accepted Kaikeyi's decree of banishment, it was because a mother should be as much regarded by a son as is a father. Even at the present day, it would be impossible to overemphasize the influence of Indian mothers not only upon their children and in all household affairs, but upon their grown-up sons to whom their word is law. According to my observation, it is only those sons who have received an English education in India who no longer honor their fathers and mothers. No story is more appropriate than that of Madalasa and her son Vikranta to illustrate the position of the Indian mother as teacher. As Vikranta grew up day by day, the Markandeya Purana relates, Madalasa taught him knowledge of the self one by ministering to him in sickness, and as he grew in strength and there waxed in him his father's heart, he attained to knowledge of the self by his mother's words. And these were Madalasa's words, spoken to the baby crying on her lap, My child, thou art without a name or form, and it is but in fantasy that thou hast been given a name. This thy body, framed of the 5 elements, is not thine in sooth, nor art thou of it. Why dost thou weep? Or, maybe, thou weepest not, it is a sound self-born that cometh forth from the king's son. In the body dwells another self, and therewith abideth not the thought that, this is mine, which appertaineth to the flesh. Shame that man is so deceived. Even in recent times, in families where the men have received an English education unrelated to Indian life and thought, the inheritance of Indian modes of thought and feeling rests in the main with women, for a definite philosophy of life is bound up with household ritual and traditional etiquette and finds expression equally in folktale and cradle song and popular poetry, and in those Puranic and epic stories which constitute the household Bible literature of India. Under these conditions, it is often the case that Indian women, with all their faults of sentimentality and ignorance, have remained the guardians of a spiritual culture which is of greater worth than the efficiency and information of the educated. It is according to the Tantric scriptures, devoted to the cult of the Mother of the World, that women, who partake of her nature more essentially than other living beings, are especially honored. Here the woman may be a spiritual teacher guru, and the initiation of a son by a mother is more fruitful than any other. One doubts how far this may be of universal application, believing with Paracelsus that woman is nearer to the world than man, of which the evidence appears in her always more personal point of view. But all things are possible to women such as Madalasa. The claim of the Buddhist nun, how should the woman's nature hinder us, has never been systematically denied in India. It would have been contrary to the spirit of Indian culture to deny to individual women the opportunity of saintship or learning in the sense of closing to them the schools of divinity or science after the fashion of the Western academies in the 19th century. But where the social norm is found in marriage and parenthood for men and women alike, it could only have been in exceptional cases and under exceptional circumstances that the latter specialized, whether in divinity, like Ovi, Mirabai, or the Buddhist nuns, in science, like Lilavati, or in war, like Chand Bibi or the Rani of Jhansi. Those set free to cultivate expert knowledge of science or to follow with undivided allegiance either religion or any art, could only be the sannyasini, a devotee, the widow, and the courtesan. A majority of women have always, and naturally, preferred marriage and motherhood to either of these conditions. But those who felt the call of religion, those from whom a husband's death removed the central motif of their life, and those trained from childhood as expert artists, have always maintained a great tradition in various branches of cultural activity, such as social service or music. What we have to observe is that Hindu sociologists have always regarded these specializations as more or less incompatible with wifehood and motherhood. Life is not long enough for the achievement of many different things. Hinduism justifies no cult of ego expression, but aims consistently at spiritual freedom. Those who are conscious of a sufficient inner life become the more indifferent to outward expression of their own or any changing personality. The ultimate purposes of Hindu social discipline are that men should unify their individuality with a wider and deeper than individual life, should fulfill appointed tasks regardless of failure or success, distinguish the timeless from its shifting forms, and escape the all too narrow prison of the I and mine. Anonymity is thus in accordance with the truth, and it is one of the proudest distinctions of the Hindu culture. The names of the authors of the epics are but shadows, and in later ages it was a constant practice of writers to suppress their own names and ascribe their work to a mythical or famous poet, thereby to gain a better attention for the truth that they would rather claim to have heard than to have made. Similarly, scarcely a single Hindu painter or sculptor is known by name, and the entire range of Sanskrit literature cannot exhibit a single autobiography but little history. Why should women have sought for modes of self-advertisement that held no lure even for men? The governing concept of Hindu ethics is vocation, dharma. The highest merit consists in the fulfillment of one's own duty, in other words, in dedication to one's calling. Indian society was highly organized, and where it was considered wrong for a man to fulfill the duties of another man rather than his own, how much more must a confusion of function as between woman and man have seemed wrong, where differentiation is so much more evident. In the words of Manu, to be mothers were women created, and to be fathers men, and he added significantly therefore are religious sacraments ordained in the Veda to be observed by the husband together with the wife. The Asiatic theory of marriage, which would have been perfectly comprehensible in the Middle Ages, before the European woman had become an economic parasite, and which is still very little removed from that of Roman or Greek Christianity, is not readily intelligible to the industrial democratic consciousness of Europe and America, which is so much more concerned for rights than for duties, and desires more than anything else to be released from responsibilities, regarding such release as freedom. It is thus that Western reformers would awaken a divine discontent in the hearts of Oriental women, forgetting that the way of ego assertion cannot be a royal road to realization of the self. The industrial mind is primarily sentimental, and therefore cannot reason clearly upon love and marriage, but the Asiatic analysis is philosophic, religious and practical. Current Western theory seeks to establish marriage on a basis of romantic love and free choice. Marriage thus depends on the accident of falling in love. Those who are crossed in love, or do not love, are not required to marry. This individualistic position, however, is only logically defensible if at the same time it is recognized that to fall out of love must end the marriage. It is a high and religious ideal which justifies sexual relations only as the outward expression demanded by passionate love and regards an intimacy continued or begun for mere pleasure, or for reasons of prudence, or even as a duty, as essentially immoral. It is an ideal which isolated individuals and groups have constantly upheld, and it may be that the ultimate development of idealistic individualism will tend to a nearer realization of it. But do not let us deceive ourselves that because the Western marriage is nominally founded upon free choice, it therefore secures a permanent unity of spiritual and physical passion. On the contrary, perhaps in a majority of cases, it holds together those who are no longer in love, habit, considerations of prudence, or, if there are children, a sense of duty often compel the passionless continuance of a marriage for the initiation of which romantic love was felt to be a sine qua non. Those who now live side by side upon a basis of affection and common interest would not have entered upon marriage on this basis alone. If the home is worth preserving under modern conditions, and in India at any rate, the family is still the central element of social organization, then probably the best solution will always be found in some such compromise as is implied in a more or less permanent marriage, though greater tolerance than is now usual must be accorded to exceptions above and below the norm. What are we going to regard as the constructive basis of the normal marriage? For Hindu sociologists, marriage is a social and ethical relationship, and the begetting of children the payment of a debt. Romantic love is a brief experience of timeless freedom, essentially religious and ecstatic, in itself is purely antisocial as every glimpse of union is a denial of the relative, it is the way of Mary. It is true the glamour of this experience may persist for weeks and months, when the whole of life is illumined by the partial merging of the consciousness of the lover and beloved, but sooner or later in almost every case there must follow a return to the world of unreality, and that insight which once endowed the beloved with innumerable perfections fades in the light of common sense. The lovers are fortunate if there remains to them a basis of common interest and common duty and a mutuality of temperament adequate for friendship, affection and forbearance. Upon this chance depends the possibility of happiness during the greater part of almost every married life. The Hindu marriage differs from the marriage of sentiment mainly in putting these considerations first. Here, as elsewhere, happiness will arise from the fulfillment of vocation, far more than when immediate satisfaction is made the primary end. I use the term vocation advisedly, for the Oriental marriage, like the Oriental actor's art, is the fulfillment of a traditional design, and does not depend upon the accidents of sensibility. To be such a man is Rama, such a wife is Sita, rather than to express oneself, is the aim. The formula is predetermined, husband and wife alike have parts to play, and it is from this point of view that we can best understand the meaning of Menas law, that a wife should look on her husband as a god, regardless of his personal merit or demerits. It would be beneath her dignity to deviate from a woman's norm merely because of the failure of a man. It is for her own sake and for the sake of the community, rather than for his alone, that life must be attuned to the eternal unity of Purusha and Prakriti. Whatever the ultimate possibilities of Western individualism, Hindu society was established on a basis of group morality. It is true that no absolute ethic is held binding on all classes alike, but within a given class the freedom of the individual is subordinated to the interest of the group. The concept of duty is paramount. How far this concept of duty trenches on the liberty of the individual may be seen in Rama's repudiation of Sita, subsequent to the victory in Lanka and the coronation at Ayodhya. Although convinced of her perfect fidelity, Rama, who stands in epic history as the mirror of social ethics, consents to banish his wife, because the people murmur against her. The argument is that if the king should receive back a wife who had been living in another man's house, albeit faithful, popular morality would be endangered, since others might be moved by love and partiality to a like rehabilitation but with less justification. Thus the social order is placed before the happiness of the individual, whether man or woman. This is the explanation of the greater peace which distinguishes the arranged marriage of the East from the self-chosen marriage of the West. Where there is no deception, there can be no disappointment. And since the conditions on which it is founded do not change, it is logical that Hindu marriage should be indissoluble. Only when social duties have been fulfilled and social debts paid, is it permissible for the householder to relinquish simultaneously the duties and the rights of the social individual. It is also logical that when the marriage is childless, it is permissible to take a second wife with the consent, and often at the wish, of the first. It is sometimes asked, what opportunities are open to the Oriental woman? How can she express herself? The answer is that life is so designed that she is given the opportunity to be a woman, in other words, to realize, rather than to express herself. It is possible that modern Europe errs in the opposite direction. We must also remember that very much which passes for education nowadays is superficial, some of it amounts to little more than parlor tricks, and nothing is gained by communicating this condition to Asia, where I have heard of modern parents who desired that their daughters should be taught a little French, or a few strokes on the violin. The arts in India are professional and vocational, demanding undivided service. Nothing is taught to the amateur by way of social accomplishment or studied superficially. And woman represents the continuity of the racial life, an energy which cannot be divided or diverted without a corresponding loss of racial vitality. She can no more desire to be something other than herself, than the Vaishya could wish to be known as a Kshatriya, or the Kshatriya, as a Brahman. It has been shown, in fact, some 75% of Western graduate women do not marry, and apart from these, if it be true that 5/6 of a child's tendencies and activities are already determined before it reaches school age, and that the habits then deeply rooted cannot be greatly modified, if it be true that so much depends on deliberate training while the instincts of the child are still potential and habits unformed, can we say that women whose social duties or pleasures, or self-elected careers or unavoidable wage slavery draws them into the outer world, are fulfilling their duty to the race, or as we should say, the debt of the ancestors? The modern suffragist declares that the state has no right to demand of woman, whether directly or indirectly, by bribe or pressure of opinion, that she considers herself under any obligation, in return for the protection afforded her, to produce its future citizens. But we are hardly likely to see this point of view accepted in these days when the right of society to conscript the bodies of men is almost universally conceded. It is true that many who do not acquiesce in the existing industrial order are prepared to resist conscription in the military sense, that is to say, conscription for destruction, but we are becoming accustomed to the idea of another kind of conscription, or rather cooperation, based on service, and indeed, according to either of the two dynamic theories of a future society, the syndicalist and the individualistic, it must appear that without the fulfillment of function there can exist no rights. From the cooperative point of view, society has an absolute right to compel its members to fulfill the functions that are necessary to it, and only those who, like the anchorite, voluntarily and entirely renounce the advantages of society and the protection of law have a right to ignore the claims of society. From the individualist point of view, on the other hand, the fulfillment of function is regarded as a spontaneous activity, as is even now true in the cases of the thinker and the artist, but even the individualist does not expect to get something for nothing, and the last idea he has is to compel the service of others. I doubt if anyone will deny that it is the function or nature of women, as a group, not necessarily in every individual case, in general, to be mothers, alike in spiritual and physical senses. What we have to do then, is not to assert the liberty of women to deny the duty or right of motherhood, however we regard it, but to accord this function a higher protection and honor than it now receives. And here, perhaps, there is still something to be learnt in Asia. There the pregnant woman is auspicious, and receives the highest respect, whereas in many industrial and secular Western societies she is an object of more or less open ridicule, she is ashamed to be seen abroad, and tries to conceal her condition, sometimes even by means that are injurious to her own and the child's health. That this was not the case in a more vital period of European civilization may be seen in all the literature and art of the Middle Ages, and particularly in the status of the Virgin Mary, whose motherhood endeared her to the folk so much more nearly than her virginity. To avoid misunderstanding, let me say in passing, that in depicting the life of Hindu women as fulfilling a great ideal, I do not mean to indicate the Hindu social formula is a thing to be repeated or imitated. This would be a view as futile as that of the Gothic revival in architecture. The reproduction of period furniture does not belong to life. A perfection that has been can never be a perfection for us. Marriage was made for man, not man for marriage. One would gladly accept for Europe very soon, and for Asia in due time, temporary marriage, the endowment of motherhood, and matriarchal succession, or whatever other forms our own spiritual and economic necessity may determine for us, not because such forms may be absolutely better than the Asiatic or medieval European institutions, but because they correspond more nearly to our inner life. In comparing one social order with another, I have no faith in any millennium past or future, but only in the best attainable adaptation of means to ends, and, let the ends determine the means, should be the evidence of our idealism. Let us now return to the Indian sati and try to understand her better. The root meaning of the word is essential being, and we have so far taken it only in the wide sense. But she who refuses to live when her husband is dead is called sati in a more special sense, and it is only so that the word sati is well known to Europeans. This last proof of the perfect unity of body and soul, this devotion beyond the grave, has been chosen by many Western critics as our reproach. We differ from them in thinking of our satis, not with pity, but with understanding, respect, and love. So far from being ashamed of our satis, we take a pride in them. That is even true of the most progressive amongst us. It is very much like the tenderness which our children's children may someday feel for those of their race who were willing to throw away their lives for their country, right or wrong, though the point of view may seem to us then, as it seems to so many already, evidence rather of generosity than balanced judgment. The criticism we make on the institution of sati and woman's blind devotion is similar to the final judgment we are about to pass on patriotism. We do not, as pragmatists may, resent the denial of the ego for the sake of an absolute, or attach an undue importance to mere life. On the contrary, we see clearly that the reckless and useless sacrifice of the sati and the patriot is spiritually significant. And what remains perpetually clear is the superiority of the reckless sacrifice to the calculating assertion of rights. Criticism of the position of the Indian woman from the ground of assertive feminism, therefore, leaves us entirely unmoved, precisely as the patriot must be unmoved by an appeal to self-interest or a merely utilitarian demonstration of futility. We do not object to dying for an idea as satis and patriots have died, but we see that there may be other and greater ideas we can better serve by living for them. For some reason it has come to be believed that sati must have been a man-made institution imposed on women by men for reasons of their own, that it is associated with feminine servility, and that it is peculiar to India. We shall see that these views are historically unsound. It is true that in aristocratic circles sati became to some degree a social convention, and pressure was put on unwilling individuals, precisely as conscripts are even now forced to suffer or die for other people's ideas, and from this point of view we cannot but be glad that it was prohibited by law in 1829 on the initiative of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. But now that nearly a century has passed, it should not be difficult to review the history and significance of sati more dispassionately than was possible in the hour of controversy and the atmosphere of religious prejudice. It is not surprising that the idea of sati occupies a considerable place in Indian literature. Parvati herself, who could not endure the insults leveled against her husband by her father, is the prototype of all others. In the early Tamil lyrics we read of an earthly bride whom the Brahmins seek to dissuade from the sacrifice, but she answers that since her lord is dead, the cool waters of the lotus pool and the flames of the funeral pyre are alike to her. Another pleads to share her hero's grave, telling the potter that she had fared with her lord over many a desert plain, and asking him to make the funeral urn large enough for both. Later in history we read of the widowed mother of Harsha that she replied to her son's remonstrances. I am the lady of a great house, have you forgotten that I am the lioness mate of a great spirit, who, like a lion, had his delight in 100 battles? A man of such towering genius and spirituality as Kabir so takes for granted the authenticity of the impulse to sati that he constantly uses it as an image of surrender of the ego to God. And indeed, in all Indian mystical literature, the love relation of woman to man is taken unhesitatingly as an immediate reflection of spiritual experience. This is most conspicuous in all the Radha Krishna literature. But here let us notice more particularly the beautiful and very interesting poem of Muhammad Riza Noi, written in the reign of Akbar upon the sati of a Hindu girl whose betrothed was killed on the very day of the marriage. This Muslim poet, to whom the Hindus were idolaters, does not relate his story in any spirit of religious intolerance or ethical condescension. He is simply amazed that after the death of men, the woman shows forth her marvelous passion. He does not wonder at the wickedness of men, but at the generosity of women. How different from the modern critic who can see no motive but self-interest behind a social phenomenon that passes his comprehension. This Hindu bride refused to be comforted and wished to be burnt on the pyre of her dead betrothed. When Akbar was informed of this, he called the girl before him and offered wealth and protection, but she rejected all his persuasion as well as the counsel of the Brahmins, and would neither speak nor hear of anything but the fire. Akbar was forced, though reluctantly, to give his consent to the sacrifice, but sent with her his son Prince Daniel, who continued to dissuade her. Even from amidst the flames, she replied to his remonstrances, "Do not annoy, do not annoy, do not annoy." Ah, exclaims the poet, let those whose hearts are ablaze with the fire of love learn courage from this pure May. Teach me, O God, the way of love, and inflame my heart with this maiden's fire. Thus he prays for himself, and for her. Do thou, O God, exalt the head of that rare hidden virgin, whose purity exceeded that of the Houris. Do thou endear her to the first kissing of her king, and graciously accept her sacrifice. Matter-of-fact accounts of more modern cities are given by Englishmen who have witnessed them. One which took place in Baroda in 1825 is described by R. Hartley Kennedy, the widow persisting in her intention in spite of several fruitless endeavors to dissuade her. A more remarkable case is described by Sir Frederick Halliday. Here also a widow resisted all dissuasion, and finally proved her determination by asking for a lamp, and holding her finger in the flame until it was burnt and twisted like a quill pen held in the flame of a candle. All this time she gave no sign of fear or pain whatever. Sir F. Halliday had therefore to grant her wish, even as Akbar had had to do 3 centuries earlier. It is sometimes said by Indian apologists that at certain times or places in India, amongst the Buddhists, or the Marathas, or in the epics there was no purdah, or that certain historic or mythic individual women were not secluded. Such statements ignore the fact that there are other kinds of seclusion than those afforded by palace walls. For example, though Rama, Lakshman and Sita had lived together in forest exile for many years in closest affection, it is expressly stated that Lakshman had never raised his eyes above his brother's wife's feet, so that he did not even know her appearance. To speak more generally, it is customary for Hindus, when occasion arises for them to address an unknown woman, to call her mother, irrespective of her age or condition. These unseen walls are a seclusion equally absolute with any purdah. One result is that the streets of an Indian city by night are safer for a woman than those of any city in Europe. I have known more than one European woman, acquainted with India, express her strong conviction of this. Western critics have often asserted that the Oriental woman is a slave, and that we have made her what she is. We can only reply that we do not identify freedom with self-assertion, and that the Oriental woman is what she is, only because our social and religious culture has permitted her to be and to remain essentially feminine. Exquisite as she may be in literature and art, we dare not claim for ourselves as men the whole honor of creating such a type, however persistently the industrious industrial critic would thrust it upon us. The Eastern woman is not, at least we do not claim that she is, superior to other women in her innermost nature. She is perhaps an older, purer and more specialized type, but certainly an universal type, and it is precisely here that the industrial woman departs from type. Nobility in women does not depend upon race, but upon ideals, it is the outcome of a certain view of life. Savitri, Padmavati, Sita, Radha, Uma, Leelavati, Tara, our divine and human heroines, have an universal fellowship, for everything feminine is of the mother. Who could have been more wholly devoted than Alcestis, more patient than Griselda, more loving than Deirdre, more soldier than Joan of Arc, more Amazon than Brynhild? When the Titanic sank, there were many women who refused, perhaps mistakenly, perhaps quite rightly, that was their own affair, to be rescued without their husbands, or were only torn from them by force. Dramatic confirmation of the conviction that love heroism is always and everywhere the same, and not only in India, nor only in ages past, may be stronger than death. I do not think that the Indian ideal has ever been the exclusive treasure of any one race or time, but rather, it reappears wherever woman is set free to be truly herself, that is, wherever a sufficiently religious, heroic and aesthetic culture has afforded her the necessary protection. Even the freedom which she seeks in modern self-assertion, which I would grant from the standpoint of one who will not govern, is merely an inverted concept of protection, and it may be that the more she is freed, the more she will reveal the very type we have most adored in those who seem to be slaves. Either way would be happier for men than the necessity of protecting women from themselves, and the tyranny of those who are not capable of friendship, being neither bound nor free. The cry of our Indian sati, do not annoy, and no one has any right over the life of another, is not that my own affair? Is no cry for protection from a fate she does not seek. It is individualistic, and has been uttered by every woman in the world who has followed love beyond the grave. Deirdre refused every offer of care and protection from conjugal. It is not land or earth or food I am wanting, she said, or gold or silver or horses, but leave to go to the grave where the sons of Asnach are lying. Emma called to Catuline slain, love of my life, my friend, my sweetheart, my one choice of the men of the world, many is the women, wed or unwed, envied me until today, and now I will not stay living after you. Irish women were free, but we are used even more to look on the old Teutonic type as representative of free and even Amazonian womanhood. We do not think of Brynhild, Shieldmay and Victory Wafter, as compelled by men to any action against her will, or as weakly submissive. Yet when Sigurd was slain she became, sati, the prayers of Gunnar availed as little as those of Conchobar with Deirdre. He laid his arms about her neck, and besought her to live and have wealth from him, and all others in likewise letted her from dying, but she thrust them all from her, and said that it was not the part of any to let her in that which was her will. And the second heroic woman figured in the saga, wedded to Sigurd, though she did not die, yet cried when he was betrayed, now am I as little as the leaf may be amid wind-swept wood. Now when dead he lieth. She who is courteous in her mind, says the Shack Tafesk, with shyness shall her face be bright, of all the beauties of the body, none is more shining than shyness. This theory of courtesy, of supreme gentleness, full sweetly bowing down her head, says the English Merlin, as she that was shamefast, runs also through all medieval chivalry. Yet it is about this shy quiet being, a mystery to men, that the whole medieval world turns. First reserve the honor to God, says Mallory, and secondly, the quarrel must come of thy lady. Like Uma and Sita, Virgin Mary is the image of a perfect being. For in this rose contained was heaven and earth in light space. And for a little while, in poetry and architecture, we glimpse an idealization of woman and woman's love akin to the praise of Radha in the contemporary songs of Chandidas and Vidyapati. But for our purpose even more significant than the religious and knightly culture, the product of less quickly changing conditions, and impressive too in its naivete, is the picture of the woman of the people which we can gather from folk song and lyric. Here was a being obviously strong and sensible, not without knowledge of life, and by no means economically a parasite. If we study the folk speech anywhere in the world, we shall see that it reveals woman, and not the man, as typically the lover. When her shyness allows, it is she who would pray for man's love, and will serve him to the utmost. Industrialism reverses this relation, making man the suppliant and the servant, a condition as unnatural as any other of its characteristic perversions. The woman of the folk does not bear resentment. Fair Helen, who followed child waters on foot, and bore his child in a stable, is overheard singing. Lullaby, my own dear child. I would thy father were a king. Thy mother laid on a bier. Is she not like the Bengali Malanchamala, whose husband had married a second wife, and left her unloved and forgotten, who says, though I die now, and become a bird or a lesser creature or whatever befall me, I care not, for I have seen my darling happy. If woman under industrialism is unsatisfied, it would be difficult to say how much man also loses. For woman is naturally the lover, the bestower of life. Conjunction with me renders lifelong. I give youth when I enter upon amorousness. Her complaint is not that man demands too much, but that he will accept too little. Long time have I been waiting for the coming of my dear. Sometimes I am uneasy and troubled in my mind. Sometimes I think I'll go to my lover and tell him my mind. But if I should go to my lover he will say me nay. If I show to him my boldness, he'll ne'er love me again. And it is to serve him, not to seek service from him, that she desires, in the cold stormy weather, when the winds are blowing. My dear, I shall be willing to wait on you then. The Oriental woman, perhaps, is not Oriental at all, but simply woman. If the modern woman could accept this thought, perhaps she would seek a new way of escape, not an escape from love, but a way out of industrialism. Could we not undertake this quest together? It is true that the modern woman is justified in her discontent. For of what has she not been robbed? The organization of society for competition and exploitation has made possible for the few, and only the very few, more physical comfort and greater security of life, but even these it has robbed of all poise, of the power to walk or to dress or to marry wisely, or to desire children or lovers, or to believe in any power not legally exteriorized. From faith in herself to a belief in votes, what a descent! Decade after decade since the 14th century has seen her influence reduced. It was paramount in religion, in poetry, in music, in architecture, and in all life. But men, when they reformed the church and taught you that love was not a sacrament without the seal of clerical approval, when they forced your music into modes of equal temperament, when they substituted knowledge for feeling and wisdom in education, when they asked you to pinch your shoes and your waists, and persuaded you to think this a refinement, and the language of Elizabethan poetry coarse, when at last they taught you to become imperialists, and went away alone to colonies and civilize the rest of the world, leaving you in England with nothing particular to do, when, if you have the chance to marry at all, it is 10 or 15 years too late, who can wonder that you are dissatisfied, and claim the right to a career of your own, not merely to earn your livelihood, but to provide yourself with an object in life? How many women have only discovered an object in life since the energies of men have been employed in activities of pure destruction? What a confession! To receive the franchise would be but a small compensation for all you have suffered, if it did not happen that we have now seen enough of representative government and the tyranny of majorities to understand their futility. Let women as well as men turn away their eyes from the delusions of government, and begin to understand direct action, finding enough to do in solving the problems of their own lives, without attempting to regulate those of other people. No man of real power has either time or strength for any other man's work than his own, and this should be equally true for women. Aside from all questions of mere lust for power or demand for rights, untold evils have resulted from the conviction that it is our God-given duty to regulate other people's lives. The effects of the current theories of uplift and of the white man's burden are only single examples of this, and even if the intentions are good, we need not overlook the fact that the way to hell is often paved with good intentions. Meanwhile, there lies an essential weakness in the propaganda of emancipation, inasmuch as the argument is based on an unquestioning acceptance of male values. The so-called feminist is as much enslaved by masculine ideals as the so-called Indian nationalist is enslaved by European ideals. Like industrial man, the modern woman values industry more than leisure. She seeks in every way to externalize her life, to achieve success in men's professions. She feigns to be ashamed of her sexual nature. She claims to be as reasonable, as learned, as expert as any man, and her best men friends make the same claims on her behalf. But just in proportion as she lacks a genuine feminine idealism, inasmuch as she wishes to be something other than herself, she lacks power. The claim of women to share the loaves and fishes with industrial man may be as just as those of Indian politicians. But the argument that women can do what men can do, we take all labor for our province, says Olive Schreiner, like the argument that Indians can be prepared to govern themselves by a course of studies in democracy, implies a profound self-distrust. The claim to equality with men, or with Englishmen, what an honor. That men, or Englishmen, as the case may be, should grant the claim, what condescension. If there is one profound intuition of the non-industrial consciousness, it is that the qualities of men and women are incommensurable. The sexes are differently entertained, says Novalis. Man demands the sensational in intellectual form, woman the intellectual in sensational form. What is secondary to the man is paramount to the woman. Do they not resemble the infinite, since it is impossible to square quadrireme them, and they can only be approached through approximation? Is not the Hindu point of view possibly right? Not that men and women should approach an identity of temperament and function, but that for the greatest abundance of life, there is requisite the greatest possible sexual differentiation. What is it that great men, poets and creators, not men of analysis, demand of women? It is, surely, the requirements of the prolific, rather than of the devourers, which are of most significance for the human race, which advances under the guidance of leaders, and not by accident. The one thing they have demanded of women is life. To one thing at least the greatest men have been always indifferent, that is, the amount of knowledge a woman may possess. It was not by her learning that Beatrice inspired Dante, or the washerwoman Chandidas. When Catullane chose a wife, it was Emma, because she had the 6 gifts of beauty, voice, sweet speech, needlework, wisdom and charity. We know only of Helen that, strangely like she was to some immortal spirit, in other words, she was radiant. Radha's shining made the ground she stood on bright as gold. The old English poet wrote of one like her looms lit as a lantern or nyht. It is this radiance in women, more than any other quality, that urges men to every sort of heroism, be it martial or poetic. Everyone understands the heroism of war. We are not surprised at Lady Hamilton's adoration of Nelson. But the activity of war is atavistic, and highly civilized people such as the Chinese regard it with open contempt. What nevertheless we do not yet understand is the heroism of art, that exhausting and perpetual demand which all creative labor makes alike on body and soul. The artist must fight a continual battle for mastery of himself in his environment. His work must usually be achieved in the teeth of violent, ignorant and often well-organized opposition, or against still more wearing apathy, and in any case, even at the best, against the intense resistance which matter opposes to the molding force of ideas, the tamasic quality in things. The ardent love of women is not too great a reward for those who are faithful. But it is far more than the reward of action, it is the energy without which action may be impossible. As pure male, the great God is inert, and his power is always feminine, and it is she who leads the hosts of heaven against the demons. When man of necessity spent his life in war or in hunting, when women needed a personal physical as well as a spiritual protection, then she could not do enough for him in personal service. We have seen in the record of folk song and epic how it is part of woman's innermost nature to worship man. In the words of another Indian scripture, her husband is for her a place of pilgrimage, the giving of alms, the performance of vows, and he is her spiritual teacher, this according to the same school which makes the initiation of son by mother 8 times more efficacious than any other. What we have not yet learnt is that like relations are needed for the finest quality of life, even under conditions of perpetual peace, the tenderness of women is necessary to man now, as ever it was when his first duty was that of physical warfare, and few men can achieve greatness, and then scarcely without the danger of a one-sided development, whose environment lacks this atmosphere of tenderness. Woman possesses the power of perpetually creating in man the qualities she desires, and this is for her an infinitely greater power than the possession of those special qualities could ever confer upon her directly. Far be it from us, however, to suggest the forcing of any preconceived development upon the modern individualist. We shall accomplish nothing by pressing anything in molds. What I have tried to explain is that notwithstanding that the formula of woman's status in Oriental society may have ere now crystallized, as the formulae of classic art have become academic, nevertheless this formula represented once, and still essentially represents, although unfelt, in realization, a veritable expression of woman's own nature. If not so, then the formula stands self-condemned. I do not know if through our modern idealistic individualism it may be possible to renounce all forms and formulae forever. I fear that it is only in heaven that there shall be neither marrying nor giving in marriage, but with that the case, and every creature free to find itself, and to behave according to its own nature, then it is possible, at least, that the natural relation of woman to man would after all involve the same conditions of magic that are implied in the soon-to-be discarded conventional and calculated forms of medieval art and Oriental society. If not, we must accept things as they really are, however they may be. Meanwhile, it would be worthwhile to pause before we make haste to emancipate, that is to say, reform and industrialize the Oriental woman. For it is not for Asia alone that she preserves a great tradition, in an age that is otherwise preoccupied. If she too should be persuaded to expend her power upon externals, there might come a time on earth when it could not be believed that such women had ever lived. As the ancient poets describe, it would be forgotten that woman had ever been unselfish, sensuous and shy. Deirdre, Brynhild, Alcestis, Sita, Radha, would then be empty names. And that would be a loss, for already it has been felt in Western schools that we are not furnished with adequate womanly ideals in history and literature. 10. The Industrial Revolution in India is of external and very recent origin. There is no lack of men, and it is the sacred duty of parents to arrange a marriage for every daughter. There is no divergence of what is spiritual and what is sensuous. Indian women do not deform their bodies in the interests of fashion. They are more concerned about service than rights. They consider barrenness the greatest possible misfortune, after widowhood. In a word, it has never happened in India that women have been judged by or have accepted purely male standards. What possible service then, except in a few externals, can the Western world render to Eastern women? Though it may be able to teach us much of the means of life, it has everything yet to relearn about life itself. And what we still remember there, we would not forget before we must.